There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a harbour in the early hours before a catastrophe, a silence so complete and ordinary that the men sleeping aboard the warships moored inside it would later describe it as the last peaceful thing they could remember. On the 3rd of July, 1940, that silence blanketed the naval base at Mers el Kebir on the sun-scorched Algerian coast, where the Marine Nationale, the French Navy, lay at anchor. The great grey hulls were still, the flags barely moved. And somewhere across the water, beyond the harbour mouth, a fleet of British warships was already in position. These were not enemy ships out there on the horizon. These were the ships of a nation that, only weeks before, had stood as France's closest ally, a partner in arms, a fellow democracy, fighting the same war against the same enemy. The men on both sides of that harbour entrance had eaten at the same tables, briefed each other on the same operations, and buried each other's dead. Yet that morning, those British guns were loaded, their crews at action stations, and their orders were clear. They were there to destroy the French fleet, or at minimum, to render it incapable of sailing for the rest of the war. What you are about to hear is not a simple story of war. It is something far more complicated than that. It is the story of a decision made by one desperate, isolated nation, a nation that stood alone against the most powerful military force Europe had ever assembled, and the impossible moral arithmetic that that decision required. It is the story of honour and betrayal, of loyalty torn in half, of admirals and prime ministers forced to choose between friendship and survival. And it is, above all else, the story of one of the strangest naval actions in the history of modern warfare. Stay with us tonight. Let the voices and the history wash over you. You do not need to memorize a single date or name. Just listen and let the story find you. If you find this documentary useful for sleep or deep relaxation, please consider leaving a comment below and subscribing to this channel. We will be with you all the way to the end. Chapter 1. The World That Broke in 40 Days. There are moments in history when the entire architecture of the world, every alliance, every assumption, every careful diplomatic structure built over decades simply collapses. Not slowly, not through gradual erosion, but all at once, in a matter of weeks, like a building whose foundations have been silently undermined, suddenly, catastrophically giving way. The spring and early summer of 1940 was exactly such a moment. What happened in those weeks did not merely change the map of Europe. It changed the terms on which everyone understood the war, the future, and the very meaning of the word possible. For France, the catastrophe began in earnest in the second week of May, 1940, when German armoured forces did something the French High Command had confidently declared impossible. They passed through the Ardennes forest rough, heavily wooded terrain that French military planners had long considered impassable for mechanized columns and emerged on the western side, cutting directly behind the Allied lines that were advancing north into Belgium. It was a strategic masterstroke. In a single movement, the best positioned and best equipped French and British forces were effectively surrounded. The campaign that followed, though it lasted several more weeks, had its outcome effectively decided in those first few days. The British Expeditionary Force and a large portion of the French Northern armies were driven back toward the English Channel. At a small port town called Dunkirk, something extraordinary happened. A desperate, improvised evacuation that has passed into legend. More than 300,000 British and French soldiers were lifted off the beaches and brought back to England across 9 days, carried by a fleet of naval vessels and small civilian craft. It was celebrated in Britain as a kind of miracle. Winston Churchill, who had been Prime Minister for less than 4 weeks by the time Dunkirk concluded, was careful to remind Parliament that evacuations are not victories. But the men were saved, even if their equipment, their guns, their vehicles, their supplies was left behind on the beach. And then France fell. The Wehrmacht rolled south. German columns occupied Paris on the 14th of June, 1940, and the images of German soldiers on the Champs-Élysées, of flags bearing the swastika draped across the Arc de Triomphe, sent a tremor through every government and every military command in the free world. The French government fled south, first to Tours, then to Bordeaux, then to the spa town of Vichy. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, who wanted to fight on, resigned. He was replaced by the aged Marshal Philippe Pétain, a hero of the previous war, now in his 80s, who immediately opened negotiations with Germany. On the 22nd of June, 1940, the armistice between France and Germany was signed at Compiègne in the same railway carriage, in the same clearing in the forest, where the humiliated Germany of 1918 had signed its own surrender at the end of the First World War. Hitler had insisted on that location personally. The symmetry was deliberate, the message unmistakable. The armistice divided France into two zones, a northern and western zone directly occupied by German forces, and a nominally independent southern zone governed by Pétain's government from Vichy. France was not destroyed, it was simply remade, and the question that now consumed London was what that remade France would do with its most powerful remaining asset, its navy. The French fleet, at the moment of the armistice, was the fourth largest in the world. It was not an antique force or a paper navy. It included some of the most advanced warships of the era fast battle cruisers, designed specifically to outrun and outgun anything they could not destroy, along with substantial surface forces, submarines, and a network of overseas bases. In terms of raw tonnage and firepower, adding the French fleet to the German Kriegsmarine and the Italian Regia Marina would have created a combined naval force capable of challenging British control of the seas. And British control of the seas was not merely a matter of strategic preference, it was the fundamental condition without which Britain could not survive. Every ton of food, every barrel of oil, every rifle, every shell, every pound of steel that Britain needed to keep fighting arrived by sea. Lose the sea lanes, and the war was lost before a single soldier set foot on British soil. This was the calculation that haunted Whitehall through the last days of June 1940. The armistice terms, on paper, contained a reassurance. The French fleet would not be handed over to Germany or Italy, but would be demobilized and kept under French control in French ports. But the question that Churchill and the War Cabinet could not stop asking was this: how much was that paper promise worth? What would happen if German pressure mounted? What would happen if the Vichy government decided that cooperation with Berlin was the safest path forward? What would happen if the French fleet, through either coercion or political accommodation, found itself operating under the direction of the same power that was now bombing British cities? The armistice said the ships would not be handed over, but armistice terms could be renegotiated. Promises, under sufficient pressure, could break. Churchill himself, in later years, would describe these weeks as the most agonizing of his life, not because he doubted what needed to be done, but because he understood with absolute clarity what doing it would cost. Attacking the French fleet meant attacking Britain's former ally. It meant killing French sailors, men who had, only weeks before, stood on the same side of the same war. It meant poisoning the well of Franco-British relations for years, perhaps decades. It meant handing to German and Italian propagandists a gift they would use with ruthless efficiency, proof, they would say, that Britain was willing to murder its friends the moment they were no longer useful. And yet, Churchill kept coming back to the same arithmetic. If the French fleet fell to Germany, the war might already be over. The War Cabinet met multiple times through the final days of June. The discussions were, by all accounts, deeply uncomfortable. Ministers who had spent their careers cultivating the Anglo-French alliance, who had travelled to Paris and dined with French officials and believed genuinely in the partnership of two great Western democracies, now had to sit across a table and discuss the clinical destruction of that partner's navy. The question was not whether to act on that, the cabinet had reached a grim consensus, but how to act, and whether to offer the French a genuine way out before force was applied. That question, whether the ultimatum was a sincere offer or merely the form that preceded a foregone conclusion, would haunt the historical record for the rest of the century. And it will be one of the threads we follow throughout this documentary, because it goes to the heart of what Operation Catapult actually was. Not simply a military action, but a moral reckoning about what nations are permitted to do when they believe their survival is at stake. The decision was made on the 27th of June, The date was set for the 3rd of July. Britain had less than a week to position its forces and prepare. The clock was already running. Chapter 2. The Weight of the Fleet. Before we can understand what was at stake on the 3rd of July, 1940, we need to understand what the French Navy actually was. Not as an abstraction, not as a line item in a strategic memorandum, but as a concrete force: the ships, the tonnage, the capabilities, and the men who served aboard them. Because the decisions made in London and at Mers el-Kabir in the first days of July were, at their core, decisions about what that fleet represented not just in the present, but in every possible future that might unfold from the wreckage of France's defeat. At the beginning of 1940, France maintained one of the most technically sophisticated navies in the world. French naval architects and engineers had developed a distinctive approach to warship design: fast, elegantly proportioned ships that prioritize speed and offensive firepower. The crown jewels of the fleet, in the summer of 1940, were the two battlecruisers, Dunkirk and Strasbourg, based at Mers el-Kabir. These were not old vessels. They were modern, fast, and heavily armed, built in the 1930s to a design that reflected the best thinking of French naval engineering. Alongside them at Mers el-Kabir sat two older battleships, the Provence and the Bretagne, along with a powerful destroyer force and a seaplane tender. Beyond Mers el-Kabir, the fleet was dispersed across multiple locations. At the Egyptian port of Alexandria, a substantial French squadron commanded by Vice Admiral René Émile Godefroy sat alongside units of the British Mediterranean Fleet. This squadron included the older battleship Lorraine and 4 cruisers. In West Africa, the incomplete but powerful battleship Richelieu had been sent to the port of Dakar for safekeeping. Her sister ship, the Jean Bart, was at Casablanca, even more incomplete. In British ports at Plymouth, Portsmouth, and elsewhere around the coast of England, dozens of smaller French vessels had been caught by the armistice. Torpedo boats, submarines, minesweepers, and auxiliaries. And at the great French Mediterranean naval base of Toulon, an enormous force of warships sat in harbour, technically on French sovereign soil, technically beyond British reach. The scale of this dispersal was itself a major logistical and strategic complication for the British. There was no single action that could neutralise the entire French fleet at once. Operation Catapult, as it was eventually conceived, was therefore not a single strike but a coordinated set of simultaneous operations, all designed to execute on the same day, the 3rd of July, so that no one element of the French fleet could warn or assist another before the moment of maximum surprise had passed. Achieving that coordination over thousands of miles of ocean, without modern communications technology, with a deadline set just days after the order was given, was itself a remarkable feat of naval planning. The man at the centre of that planning was Admiral of the Fleet Sir Dudley Pound, the first Sea Lord. Pound was 63 years old in the summer of 1940, and the weight of the war was already visible on him. He was not a charismatic figure in the way that some naval commanders are. He did not inspire through grand gesture or theatrical confidence. What he possessed was something more austere, an absolute, unsparing grasp of naval logistics and strategic risk, and a willingness to make calculations that others flinched from. It was Pound who turned the cabinet's political decision into an operational plan, and it was Pound who, late on the night of the 2nd of July, sat down with Churchill at Downing Street to finalise the precise terms of the ultimatum that would be delivered to the French the following morning. The man chosen to deliver that ultimatum at Mers el-Kabir was Vice Admiral Sir James Somerville, newly appointed as commander of Force H, the strike force assembled at Gibraltar specifically for this operation. Somerville was, in many ways, an unusual choice for what was certain to become one of the most controversial assignments of the war. He was known throughout the Royal Navy as a humane commander, a man who had a genuine talent for relating to the sailors under his command and who took the welfare of his crews with unusual seriousness. He was also, by reputation, a man of independent judgment, someone who did not simply absorb orders from above and execute them without reflection. These qualities would matter enormously in the hours ahead, because Somerville, before Operation Catapult was over, would be the man who had to give the order to fire, and he would have to live with that order for the rest of his life. Force H, assembled at Gibraltar in the final days of June, was a formidable collection of warships. At its centre was HMS Hood, the largest and most famous warship in the Royal Navy, a vast, graceful battlecruiser that had been the pride of the fleet since the 1920s and was regarded, both at home and abroad, as a symbol of British naval power. Alongside Hood were the battleships Resolution and Valiant, the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, the cruisers Arethusa and Enterprise, and 15 destroyers. It was the kind of force that made harbour entrance calculations straightforward. Somerville's guns outranged anything Gensoul could bring to bear from inside the port, and the aircraft from Ark Royal could reach over the harbour walls and beyond. The French ships at Mers el-Kébir, moored in a harbour with a restricted entrance channel, were in a deeply disadvantageous tactical position if it came to a fight, which is precisely why London had chosen Mers el-Kébir as the primary target. The man who commanded the French squadron at Mers el-Kébir was Vice Admiral Marcel Gensoul, a capable career naval officer who found himself, through no fault of his own, at the centre of an impossible situation. Gensoul was not a politician, he was not a diplomat. He was a naval officer of the old school, formed by decades of service in an institution that placed enormous value on honour, hierarchy, and the keeping of one's word. The armistice, in Gensoul's understanding, was a legitimate act of the French government, and the terms of that armistice gave him clear instructions. Keep the fleet in French hands, do not surrender it, do not allow it to be used against France's former allies, and if all else failed, scuttle it rather than let it fall into enemy hands. He had received explicit orders to this effect from Admiral Darlan. He believed he was operating within the parameters of an honourable settlement. What he had not anticipated was that those parameters would be tested, not by Germany, but by Britain. Above Gensoul, in the French naval chain of command, stood Admiral François Darlan, perhaps the most complex and contested figure in the entire story of the French fleet in 1940. Darlan was the commander-in-chief of the Marine Nationale and, after the armistice, the naval minister of the Vichy government. He was a man of tremendous ambition, powerful pride, and a personal detestation of the British that had deep roots going back decades. Some accounts trace it to his great-grandfather's death at the Battle of Trafalgar, though that connection is almost certainly apocryphal. What is not apocryphal is that Darlan genuinely did not want his ships to fall into German hands. He issued standing orders to every French commander that their ships were to be scuttled before they could be seized. He believed this private assurance backed by a French officer's honour should have been sufficient for London. London did not agree. And so, on the 1st of July, 1940, the British War Cabinet formalised its decision. The French fleet would be given the opportunity to join the British cause, to sail to neutral waters, or to scuttle itself. If none of those options were accepted, Force H would destroy it. The date was set. The forces were in position. And somewhere between the cold logic of that decision and the human reality of what it meant more than 1,000 men who had been allies weeks before lay the moral weight that would press down on everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Chapter 3. Two Admirals. One morning, the morning of the 3rd of July, 1940, broke clear over the Algerian coast. It was a summer morning in the Mediterranean, which is to say it was warm and bright and utterly at peace with the world in a way that bore no relation whatsoever to what was about to happen. The harbour at Mers el-Kébir sits just west of the port city of Oran, tucked into a bay where the Atlas Mountains slope down toward the sea, and in the early hours of that day, the French ships at anchor there presented a scene of organised military routine sailors going about their duties, the watch changeovers, the ordinary housekeeping of warships in a peacetime port, because that is what it still felt like, whatever the armistice papers said. Then, just after 7 in the morning, the horizon changed. 30 minutes later, HMS Hood came into full view from the harbour, and behind her, the rest of Force H Resolution, Valiant, Ark Royal, the cruisers, and their destroyer escort. It was not a subtle approach. The British were not attempting to disguise their presence. They arrived in full formation, the largest warships flying their battle ensigns, the kind of approach that made it immediately unambiguously clear to every French sailor who could see it that this was not a courtesy call or a fleet exercise. The ships that had been their allies were now blockading them inside their own harbour. The first move was not a gunshot, it was a question. Admiral Somerville chose to send a single ship ahead of the main force HMS Foxhound, a destroyer carrying a man named Captain Cedric Holland, who had spent several years in Paris as the British naval attaché before the war. Holland knew French naval officers personally. He spoke French. He understood the culture, the sensitivities, the particular codes of honour that governed the French naval mind. If anyone could thread the needle of this impossible situation, deliver an ultimatum that Britain was absolutely serious about while giving Gensoul a genuine path to accepting it, it was Holland. That, at least, was the thinking in London. Whether it reflected the reality of what happened over the next several hours is a question the historical record forces us to examine carefully. Holland reached the harbour entrance and requested a meeting with Admiral Gensoul. What happened next would become one of the most examined and most disputed sequences of events in the entire story of Operation Catapult. Gensoul did not come to meet Holland himself. Instead, he sent his flag lieutenant, Bernard Duffy, to intercept Holland in the water at the harbour entrance and receive the British communication on his behalf. Holland handed over the written ultimatum, a document laying out the 4 options available to Gensoul: join the British and continue fighting Germany and Italy, sail to a British port with reduced crews, sail under British escort to a French port in the Caribbean, where the ships would be disarmed or transferred to the United States, or scuttle within 6 hours. Gensoul read the document. He sent back, through Duffy, a categorical refusal. He would not accept any of the terms. He framed his response in terms of honour. He was a French naval officer, operating under the lawful authority of the French government and the legitimate armistice, and he would not surrender his ships or his command to a foreign power. He also signalled Paris, reporting that he was being presented with an ultimatum and requesting instructions. Crucially, and this is a detail that historians have returned to again and again, the signal Gensoul sent to Paris described only 3 options, not 4. The 4th option, sailing to the Caribbean, which might have offered a genuine diplomatic route through the impasse, was apparently not included in his summary. Whether this was an oversight or a deliberate decision to simplify the situation for his superiors, the effect was the same. Paris did not fully understand the range of choices on the table. As Gensoul signalled Paris and Paris began to respond, the morning ground on, the harbour was becoming a place of growing tension. Gensoul ordered his ships to raise steam to prepare their boilers for the possibility of movement, and the lookouts on HMS Hood could see the smoke rising from French funnels. This was read in Somerville's operations room as a warning sign. The French might be preparing to attempt a breakout, to force their way out of the harbour and make for open water. The destroyers and torpedo boats of Force H were repositioned to prevent this. A kind of slow, tense dance was unfolding, each side reading the other's movements, each side preparing for a confrontation that neither, individually, wanted. Through all of this, Somerville was engaged in his own communications with London. He had received his orders, he understood them. But he was also deeply troubled by the situation in front of him, and the telegrams he sent back to the Admiralty during those hours reveal a man in genuine anguish. He pushed back, gently but persistently, arguing that the French position was not necessarily as hostile as it appeared from London, that Gensoul seemed to believe his honour was at stake, and that an approach that allowed him to preserve that honour might yet succeed where simple ultimatums had failed. London's response was, essentially, to hold the line. The deadline was the deadline, the terms were the terms. Somerville was a naval commander, not a diplomat. He had his orders. Holland and Gensoul finally met face to face in the stifling heat of the Dunkirk's main cabin in the late afternoon, at around 4:15 in the afternoon, by the reconstructed timeline, well into a day of failed diplomacy and rising tension. In that meeting, Gensoul produced something unexpected. A copy of a signal from Admiral Darlan, dated the 27th of June, instructing all French fleet commanders that their ships were to be scuttled if the Germans ever attempted to seize them. Here, Gensoul seemed to be arguing was the assurance Britain claimed it needed proof, in writing, from the commander of the French Navy that these ships would never fall into German hands. Holland understood the significance of what he was being shown. He reported back to Somerville, but by now the clock had run almost to its limit. The afternoon light began to lengthen. Somerville sent a final signal to Gensoul. Unless the British terms were accepted by 5:30 in the afternoon, he would open fire. The message reached Gensoul. He read it. Around that same time, Paris, finally understanding the gravity of the situation, ordered French naval forces in the Mediterranean to converge on Mers el-Kébir in support of Gensoul. Somerville, reading French signal traffic, knew that reinforcements were potentially inbound. The tactical window was closing. Holland returned to his destroyer. Gensoul watched him go, and, by one account, said farewell with surprising warmth, the warmth of a man who knows that something irreversible is about to happen, and who is not yet sure how to feel about it. At exactly 12 minutes before 6 in the evening, the British ships opened fire. Chapter 4: The Guns of Mers el-Kébir. There are moments in human history that seem, in retrospect, to mark an absolute before and after moment so decisive, so terrible, so charged with consequence, that nothing that follows can be properly understood without them. The bombardment of Mers el-Kébir on the afternoon of the 3rd of July, 1940, was such a moment. Not because of its scale, there were battles in that same war that lasted longer, involved more ships, and produced greater casualties. But because of what it meant: allies killing allies, and the world watching. The range was approximately 16 kilometers, roughly 10 miles. At that distance, the great 15-inch guns of HMS Hood and her consorts could lay shell after shell across the confined waters of the harbour with a precision that the French ships, moored at fixed anchorings, had no effective way to counter. The harbour entrance was narrow, the channel was shallow in places, the French capital ships were large and required sea room to manoeuvre. What had been, in peacetime, the natural protection of a sheltered harbour was now, in these few terrible minutes, a trap. The firing lasted approximately 10 minutes. In those 10 minutes, the British capital ships delivered around 150 shells into the harbour area. The Bretagne, one of the older French battleships, a vessel of considerable size and historic service, was struck by a massive explosion and capsized. She sank quickly. The men trapped below her decks, in her engine rooms and magazines, had almost no time. The Dunkirk was struck and badly damaged. She would eventually be beached to prevent her from sinking. The Provence was also hit and damaged. A destroyer, the Mogador, was struck and severely disabled. Other ships, smaller vessels, were hit and damaged by the general weight of fire. In those 10 minutes, 1,297 French sailors were killed or went missing. 354 more were wounded. These were not faceless statistics. They were men who had been trained and equipped by the French Republic, who had sworn their oaths to their country and their service, who had been at sea for months in defence of an alliance they believed in, and who had been, only weeks before this day, brothers in arms with the men now firing at them. The grief that followed in France, in French naval circles, in the communities that supplied those ships with their crews, was enormous and lasting. Several French ships did manage to get clear of the harbour. The Strasbourg, one of the modern battlecruisers that Somerville had been specifically ordered to ensure, did not escape, broke, free of the blockade under fire, making for open water at high speed. Aircraft from HMS Ark Royal were launched in pursuit, but Strasbourg was fast and her crew was fighting with everything they had. She successfully reached the French port of Toulon. The failure to stop her would become one of the most criticised aspects of the entire operation from a purely military standpoint. Somerville, already deeply uncomfortable with what he had been ordered to do, was also now facing scrutiny for having allowed the most modern unit of the Mers el-Kébir squadron to escape. On the British side, the material losses were almost non-existent. The French ships, caught in harbour and unable to manoeuvre effectively, put up return fire and French gunnery was not poor, but the shots fell between HMS Hood and HMS Valiant rather than on them. 5 British aircraft were shot down during the action and its immediate aftermath, and 2 naval airmen were killed. For Britain, the military cost of the operation was minimal. For France, the morning had been a disaster measured in lives. In the hours immediately following the bombardment, the nature of the operation was not yet fully visible to the outside world. The French were trying to understand what had happened, counting their casualties, accounting for their ships. The British were filing battle reports and attempting to assess whether the primary objectives, the destruction or neutralization of the main French fleet at Mers el-Kébir, had been achieved. The answer was complicated. The Bretagne was gone. The Dunkirk and Provence were out of action, at least for now. The destroyer force had been damaged, but the Strasbourg was free and heading east. And the political and diplomatic consequences of the past 10 minutes were only beginning to unfold. In London, Churchill received the reports as they came in. He had not been at peace with this decision. No one involved had been. The calculation had been made, the orders had been given, the action had been executed, but calculation, even cold and correct calculation, does not protect a person from the weight of what it has produced. Churchill would stand before Parliament 2 days later and speak about the action at Mers el-Kébir with a composure that one observer described as unlike anything he had ever heard before in that chamber. A composure that masked. Those close to him understood something quite different. The House of Commons responded with what was described as the most emotional cheering of the entire war. Not because Parliament was happy about what had happened, but because it understood, in its gut, what the decision meant. Britain was not going to negotiate. Britain was not going to surrender. Britain was going to fight on, regardless of what it cost. Across France and across the French colonies, the reaction was entirely different. The news of Mers el-Kébir arrived as a shock that quickly hardened into fury. The Vichy government broke off diplomatic relations with Britain. In the streets, in the cafes, in the barracks, the story was shaped and reshaped by Vichy propagandists into a narrative of British treachery, the stabbing in the back of a fallen friend, the piracy of a cynical empire. For those French men and women who still wanted to believe that Britain was worth fighting for, the news from Mers el-Kébir was a profound test. For those who had already concluded that Vichy was the necessary path, it was confirmation of everything they had said. And for Admiral Darlan, who had issued the very scuttling orders that London claimed to distrust, Mers el-Kébir was personal. His fleet, his men, his honour. The wound would never fully heal. But the story was not over. The 3rd of July was not the end of Operation Catapult. It was barely the beginning. Because across the Mediterranean, in Alexandria, an entirely different drama was unfolding. One that would produce an entirely different outcome, and one that would raise, in the sharpest possible terms, the question of whether the killing at Mers el-Kébir had truly been necessary at all. Chapter 5. The Admiral Who Chose Differently. There is a counterpoint to Mers el-Kébir, and it matters enormously to how we understand the events of the 3rd of July, 1940. It matters because it happened on the same day, under the same orders, with the same ultimatum, and between the same 2 navies. And it ended without a single shot being fired, without a single man being killed, through the application of patience, personal trust, and what one historian would later describe as high diplomacy of an unexpected kind. In the harbour of Alexandria, on the northeastern coast of Egypt, a French naval squadron had been based alongside units of the British Mediterranean Fleet since the outbreak of the war. The French force designated Force X by the British was commanded by Vice Admiral René-Émile Godefroy. It was a substantial force, the older battleship Lorraine and 4 cruisers, along with supporting vessels. These ships had fought alongside the British in the Mediterranean. Their officers and men had shared the same harbour, the same waters, the same cause. The relationship between the French and British sailors at Alexandria was, by the accounts of those who were there, genuinely warm. The British commander at Alexandria was Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, known throughout the Royal Navy simply as ABC, a man of extraordinary tactical brilliance and what could only be called a genius for understanding human beings. Cunningham had received the same orders as Somerville. He was to secure the French squadron, either bring it over to the British side or neutralize it. Force was authorized if necessary. The deadline was the same. The ultimatum was the same. What was different was Cunningham's judgment about how to use the hours before that deadline, where Somerville, for all his personal anguish about the operation, ultimately executed the bombardment when the deadline passed. Cunningham chose a different approach from the very beginning. He knew Godefroy. They had worked together for months. He understood that Godefroy was a man of honor, and that treating him as an enemy surrounding his ships with hostile forces, presenting an ultimatum with the implication of imminent violence, would harden rather than soften his resistance. So Cunningham ignored some of the more aggressive directives that came from London and focused instead on the personal relationship. He talked to Godefroy. He explained, directly and honestly, the position that Britain was in, and why London had concluded that the ships could not simply remain in place as they were. Godefroy was furious. He had heard the news from Mers el-Kébir. He knew what had happened to his colleagues, to the fleet he served, to the men he knew by name. He threatened to open fire on the British ships rather than surrender. He threatened to sail his squadron out to sea regardless of the consequences. The situation at Alexandria, on the morning and afternoon of the 3rd of July, was genuinely explosive, not in the distant strategic sense of the problem at Mers el-Kébir, but in the immediate, personal, ship's length sense of two fleets in the same harbour preparing for a fight neither of them wanted. What saved the situation was not force, and not the threat of force. It was the continuation of honest, respectful conversation over days, and the application of something that does not always find its way into military histories: empathy. Cunningham understood that Godefroy needed to preserve his honour and that of his men. He understood that any solution which looked like a surrender would be rejected immediately. So he worked with Godefroy to find a formulation that both sides could accept, one that would take the French ships out of the operational equation without requiring the French to formally capitulate to British authority. By the 6th of July, 1943 days after the guns had fallen silent at Mers el-Kébir, Godefroy agreed to an arrangement. The French ships at Alexandria would remain in the harbour, immobilised, with their oil fuel removed and their gun breach mechanisms placed in British custody to prevent them from being used. The French sailors would remain aboard, under French authority, with the option of repatriation to France for those who chose it. The ships would not join the British cause, that was not what this was, but they would not be available for any other purpose either. It was, in the grimly pragmatic terms of wartime logic, exactly what London had asked for: French naval power removed from the equation. The contrast between Alexandria and Mers el-Kébir was immediately apparent to everyone involved. 1,297 men had died at Mers el-Kébir. At Alexandria, not a single life was lost. The same ships, the same navy, the same political situation, the same British ultimatum, and two completely different outcomes. The question that contrast implicitly raised was one that historians have been wrestling with ever since. Was Mers el-Kébir necessary? Could patient diplomacy, of the kind Cunningham applied at Alexandria, have worked at Oran as well? The honest answer is that we cannot know for certain. The circumstances were not identical. Gensol was not Godefroy. Somerville, for all his personal qualities, was dealing with a larger force, a more restricted harbour, and a less established personal relationship with the French commander. The reinforcements that France was sending toward Mers el-Kébir created a genuine time pressure that Cunningham did not face in Alexandria. And the British political calculus in the hours before the bombardment was not purely military, it was also about sending a message to the world, to Washington, to Berlin, and to every neutral nation watching, that Britain would do whatever was necessary to survive. Alexandria could not have sent that message alone. Mers el-Kébir, with all its dreadful cost, could and did. But none of that changes the fact that on the same day, under the same orders, with the same tools available, one British admiral chose patience and achieved his objective without killing anyone, and another chose force and killed nearly 1,300 men who had been allies weeks before. That fact does not indict Somerville. He was following orders, under genuine time pressure, in a situation made nearly impossible by the failures of communication and negotiation that preceded the bombardment. But it does suggest that the outcome of Mers el-Kabir was not as inevitable as the logic of the ultimatum made it appear. Chapter 6. What remained and what followed. Mers el-Kabir was the largest and most visible action of Operation Catapult, but it was not the only one. On the same morning that Force H was blockading the Algerian harbour, another set of events was unfolding in the ports of Britain itself, events that were, in some ways, more clinical and in others more personal than what happened at sea. In the early hours of the 3rd of July, 1940, British forces moved simultaneously against every French warship in British territorial waters. The operation was designed to happen fast, before any alarm could be raised, before French crews could respond or receive orders from Paris. At Plymouth, Portsmouth, and other ports around England and Scotland, boarding parties went aboard French ships and took control. In the vast majority of cases, the takeover was achieved without serious resistance. French officers, caught completely off guard, found British sailors at their gangways, and British officers informing them, in the formal tones of naval authority, that their ships were now under British control until the disposition of the French fleet could be determined. There was, in almost all of these takeovers, a deep and uncomfortable awkwardness. These were not enemy ships or enemy crews being seized as prizes of war. They were the vessels and men of an ally, or at least a former ally, a nation that was now technically neutral, or at least ambiguously so under the terms of the armistice. The French officers affected by the British action were, in many cases, men who had trained alongside their British counterparts, who had attended the same exercises and conferences, who in some cases had personal friendships with the very officers now informing them that they were, effectively, being detained. The dignity with which many of those encounters were handled, on both sides, speaks to something important about the professional culture of the Naval Officer Corps in 1940. Even in circumstances of profound betrayal, there was a form of courtesy that both sides seemed to understand was the minimum owed. A single French sailor was killed during the seizures in British ports, in an incident that appears to have resulted from a misunderstanding in the fog and tension of the operation. That one death, among a total day's toll of well over 1,000, is worth noting precisely because it shows how different things might have been everywhere, had circumstances allowed. 5 days after Mers el-Kabir, on the 7th of July, the final major piece of Operation Catapult played out off the West African port of Dakar, where the powerful but incomplete battleship Richelieu had been sent for safekeeping. Richelieu was not fully operational, she had only recently left the shipyard, and her armament was not entirely fitted. But she was large, well-armoured, and her 6 15-inch guns, even partially operational, represented a capability that London could not ignore. Aircraft from HMS Hermes, a British carrier operating in West African waters, launched a torpedo attack against Richelieu in Dakar harbour. The attack caused significant damage and put Richelieu out of action for an extended period. She was not destroyed, but she was neutralised. The purpose of the attack had been achieved. The situation at Toulon, the great French naval base on the Mediterranean coast of southern France, remained unresolved in the immediate aftermath of Operation Catapult, and would remain so for more than 2 more years. The ships at Toulon were technically in French-controlled territory, which meant that Britain had no legal basis and no practical military means to act against them. They sat there, a permanent source of anxiety for the British and a permanent subject of negotiation between Germany and the Vichy government. London watched and waited and hoped that Darlan's standing orders to scuttle would hold if the Germans ever moved to claim them. In November of 1942, when German forces moved to occupy the previously unoccupied zone of France and German troops moved toward Toulon, those orders did hold. The French fleet at Toulon was scuttled by its own crews, denying it to Germany just as Darlan had always said it would be. It was a validation of the argument France had always made that the fleet would never fall to Germany. It was also an argument that came 2 years too late to undo what had happened at Mers el-Kabir. In the weeks following Operation Catapult, the diplomatic and political consequences played out across multiple arenas. Vichy France broke off formal diplomatic relations with Britain and, in a gesture of retaliatory military action, launched bombing raids from French North Africa against the British base at Gibraltar. The relationship between the two nations, which had been one of the closest in European history, built over decades of alliance, cultural exchange, and shared experience, was broken in a way that would take years even to begin to repair. The bitterness was genuine, and it ran deep. French sailors who had survived Mers el-Kébir carried it with them. French officers who had been detained in British ports carried it with them. The families of the 1,297 dead carried it in a way that never entirely faded. And yet, from the perspective of London's original purpose, Operation Catapult had largely achieved what it set out to achieve. The largest and most capable portion of the French fleet that had been accessible to British action was either destroyed, immobilized, or at least temporarily put out of commission. The Strasbourg had escaped to Toulon, which was a failure. The Richelieu would eventually be repaired and would rejoin the war, ultimately on the Allied side, after the Allied landings in North Africa shifted the political alignments of the French Empire. But the immediate threat, the nightmare scenario of a powerful, intact French fleet steaming under the swastika or the tricolour of a German-controlled Vichy navy into the Atlantic, had been foreclosed, at least for now. What remained, and what would remain as a permanent feature of the history of the Second World War, was the question of what Operation Catapult said about the nature of the choices that nations make when they believe their survival is at stake. Churchill had acted on the principle that survival required the willingness to do things that were not merely costly, but genuinely terrible: to break alliances, to kill friends, to commit acts that would be judged harshly in more comfortable times, on the grounds that those acts were necessary to prevent something worse. History has largely endorsed that judgment, or at least refused to condemn it outright. The French fleet did not fall to Germany. The Atlantic did not become a German lake. Britain fought on. But that endorsement has never been, and cannot be, a complete answer. The 1,297 men who died at Mers el-Kébir on the 3rd of July, 1940, were not abstractions. They were sons, fathers, husbands, friends, sailors who had served their country and their alliance with honour, and who died, not at the hands of Germany, but at the hands of the nation they had been fighting alongside. The weight of that fact does not go away simply because the decision that caused it was, by the cold arithmetic of strategic survival, arguably the right one. Both things are true. That is the particular, enduring anguish of Operation Catapult, and it is the anguish that this documentary will return to, again and again, as we continue through the full history of these extraordinary events. If you are still here with us, still listening, we are glad. There is much more of this story still to tell, and the chapters ahead will take us deeper into the diplomatic shadows, the political battles, and the extraordinary human stories of the officers and men caught inside one of the most consequential naval decisions of the 20th century. Stay with us. We will keep the pace slow and steady, just for you. And if you found this useful tonight, a like and a subscribe means the world to us. It helps others find the kind of rest they are looking for too. Chapter 7. The Man Who Held the Fleet. To understand Operation Catapult fully, you need to understand François Darlan, not as a cartoon villain, not as a loyal patriot, not as a simple collaborator, because none of those labels fits the man who stood at the center of the French Navy's fate in the summer and autumn of 1940. Darlan was something more complicated than any of those categories allow. He was a man of enormous ability and enormous pride, a naval officer who had spent his entire adult life building and shaping the Marine Nationale into the fourth most powerful navy in the world, and who found himself, at the moment of that navy's greatest crisis, caught between loyalties that pulled in fundamentally incompatible directions. Understanding his choices and the reasoning behind them is essential to understanding why Mers el-Kébir happened and why the consequences of that event echoed so far and so long. François Darlan was born in 1881 in the Lot-et-Garonne department of southwestern France, into a family with deep Republican roots. His father had been a government minister. His grandfather had served France in earlier wars. The family tradition was one of public service, of placing national duty above personal comfort, of believing that France was worth the sacrifice of ordinary life. Darlan entered the Naval Academy as a young man and rose through the ranks with a combination of technical excellence, political intelligence, and an unusual willingness to engage with the administrative and bureaucratic dimensions of naval power, the unglamorous business of budgets, shipbuilding programs, personnel policy, and institutional reform that determines whether a navy is genuinely capable or merely impressive on paper. By the late 1930s, he was Commander-in-Chief of the Marine Nationale, and the fleet he had helped to build was, by most objective assessments, a genuinely formidable fighting force. Darlan's attitude toward Britain was complicated before the war and became considerably more complicated after June of 1940. There is a version of the story popular in British accounts of the period that attributes his Anglophobia to a personal animus rooted in family history, specifically the claim that his ancestor died at Trafalgar. Historians have generally treated this claim with skepticism. What is better documented is that Darlan, like many French naval officers of his generation, felt that Britain had historically been willing to prioritize its own interests over those of its alliance partners, and that this tendency had been visible in the way the British Expeditionary Force's evacuation at Dunkirk had been managed. He believed, not without some justification, that the British had gotten their men off the beach at Dunkirk, while French forces bore a disproportionate share of the rearguard action. Whether this perception was entirely fair is debatable. That it was genuinely held by Darlan and many of his colleagues is not. After the armistice, Darlan made his central commitment explicit. He would not surrender the French fleet to Germany. He issued written orders to every fleet commander, in clear and unambiguous language, stating that French warships were to be scuttled rather than allowed to fall into German or Italian hands. This was not a casual assurance, it was a standing operational order, backed by his authority as the commander of the French Navy, and from July of 1940 onward, by his position as naval minister of the Vichy government. Darlan appears to have genuinely believed that this commitment, which he understood as a matter of personal and professional honour, should have been sufficient for London. He expected the British to trust him in the way that one professional officer trusts another. What he could not fully grasp, or would not grant, was why London might find that trust insufficient in a world where the political pressures on Vichy from Germany were growing by the week. The 48 hours before the bombardment at Mers el-Kébir were, from Darlan's perspective, a series of escalating provocations. He received Gensol's report that a British ultimatum had been delivered, and that the terms included demands that he regarded as incompatible with French honour and sovereignty. He ordered Gensol to refuse. He simultaneously ordered French naval forces in the Western Mediterranean to converge on Oran, a movement that the British intercepted from signals traffic and that contributed to Somerville's sense of time pressure. He also, in those same hours, communicated directly to the British through back channels that the fleet would never be surrendered to Germany. Those communications did not reach the relevant decision-makers in London in time to affect the outcome, or if they did, were not judged to be sufficiently reliable to justify standing down the operation. When the news of the bombardment reached Darlan, something changed in him that did not fully change back. The anger was not merely political or strategic, it was intensely personal. These were his ships and his men, the institutions to which he had devoted his professional life, destroyed not by the enemy they had been built to fight, but by the ally they had been built alongside. He threw himself into the work of the Vichy government with a new energy, and the direction of that energy toward accommodation with Germany rather than resistance was shaped, at least in part, by what had happened in that harbour in Algeria. Darlan's subsequent career, his service as the second most powerful figure in the Vichy hierarchy, his negotiations with the Germans over French colonial cooperation, all of it played out in the shadow of the 3rd of July, 1940. There is a moment, in the later literature of the period, where some historians have asked whether a different approach to Darlan, a more direct engagement with him personally, at the political rather than the military level, might have produced a different outcome. What if Churchill had spoken directly to Darlan, rather than routing everything through the ultimatum handed to Gensol? What if the private assurances that Darlan kept offering through back channels had been treated as the starting point for a real negotiation, rather than as insufficient cover for military action? These questions cannot be answered definitively. What we can say is that the relationship between Churchill and Darlan, which had begun with mutual respect during the period of Franco-British alliance, became, after Mers el-Kébir, one of the most poisoned bilateral relationships in the entire diplomatic history of the war. They would be forced to deal with each other again in circumstances that neither could have predicted, and the shadow of the 3rd of July would lie over every one of those dealings. Darlan's personal story ended in a way that was as dramatic and improbable as anything in the wider Operation Catapult narrative. In November of 1942, when Allied forces landed in North Africa as part of Operation Torch, Darlan happened to be in Algiers, visiting his ill son. He was caught, essentially, in Allied-held territory, with almost no protection and no means of escape. What followed was a pragmatic negotiation. The Americans, under General Dwight Eisenhower, decided that working with Darlan was more useful than imprisoning or shooting him, and a deal was struck under which Darlan ordered French forces in North Africa to cease resistance to the Allied landings in exchange for recognition as the senior French authority in the region. It was one of the most morally controversial decisions of the entire war, causing outrage in London and among the Free French of Charles de Gaulle. And it was, in a deeply bitter irony, made necessary in part by the damage that Mers el-Kébir had done to the French willingness to cooperate with the British. Darlan was assassinated by a French royalist gunman on the 24th of December 1942 in Algiers, before the full consequences of his complex and compromised career could fully play out. The story of Darlan is, ultimately, the story of what happens when genuine loyalty and genuine competence are applied in service of a political accommodation that history will judge harshly. He was not a traitor in any simple sense. He was a man who made choices that he believed served France's interests, and who paid a price for those choices that no one had anticipated. But his career, from the summer of 1940 onward, illustrates a truth that Operation Catapult made painfully visible. In a world where the familiar certainties of alliance and shared purpose have collapsed, the choices that individuals make about where to stand are shaped not only by calculation, but by wounds that have not healed. Mers el-Kébir wounded Darlan deeply, and the consequences of that wound reverberated through the entire subsequent history of the French relationship with the Allied cause. What Darlan represents, in the full arc of this story, is the human cost of institutional decisions, the way in which choices made at the level of war cabinets and admiralty boards land, eventually, in the hearts and careers of individual men who must live with their consequences. He held the fleet, as long as it could be held, against the one enemy he had always feared it would face. He never fully accepted that the decision made in London on the 27th of June 1940 was anything other than a betrayal. And in the long, complicated middle distance between his understanding of events and history's subsequent judgment, there is a space that honest inquiry cannot simply close. Chapter 8. Force H, and the men who sailed it. There is a tendency, in histories of Operation Catapult, to focus on the high-level decision-making, on Churchill, on Darlan, on the War Cabinet, on the strategic logic that drove the British action. This focus is understandable, because those decisions were consequential and their logic is genuinely interesting. But it risks obscuring something important, the human reality of what it meant for the officers and men of Force H to sail to the harbour of a former ally and open fire on ships that, weeks earlier, had been on the same side of the same war. The ordinary sailors and junior officers of that force have often been crowded out of the story by the larger figures. They deserve better than that. Force H was assembled at Gibraltar in the final days of June 1940, with a speed that reflected both the urgency of the situation and the considerable organisational capacity of the Royal Navy. The process of assembling such a force, routing ships from different commands, some of which had been at sea for extended periods, some of which had crews that had been through the traumatic experience of the Dunkirk evacuation and the Norway campaign, was not simply a matter of logistics, it was also a matter of morale. The men who crewed HMS Hood, HMS Valiant, HMS Resolution, HMS Ark Royal, and the destroyers and cruisers of the squadron were aware, to varying degrees, of the purpose for which Force H was being assembled. Some knew exactly what was coming, others had only rumors and guesswork. Most understood, in the way that experienced sailors understand the atmosphere of a fleet preparing for an operation, that what lay ahead was going to be unlike anything that had come before. James Somerville was 52 years old when he received his appointment as commander of Force H. He had spent his career in a navy that believed, with the fervency of an institutional religion, that command required the full commitment of the officer's person, not merely his professional judgment, but his moral energy, his sense of responsibility for the men under him, his willingness to be accountable for the consequences of his orders. Somerville was, by all accounts, exactly that kind of officer. He was also a man who had spent the early weeks of June 1940 in an unsettling kind of professional limbo. He had been invalided out of active command the previous year following a false diagnosis of tuberculosis, had been cleared and restored to health, and was waiting for a suitable appointment when the crisis in France broke. His appointment to Force H was made at speed, at a moment when the Admiralty needed someone of flag rank who could be trusted to execute a deeply sensitive operation with both military competence and personal integrity. Somerville's discomfort with his orders was genuine and documented. In the signals he sent from Force H to the Admiralty in the hours before the bombardment, and in private correspondence that survived the war, he made clear that he believed the ultimatum being delivered to Gensol was unlikely to succeed, and that the political decision had, in some important respects, foreclosed the possibility of the diplomatic resolution that might otherwise have been achievable. He was not insubordinate, he was, in the end, the officer who gave the order to open fire, because that was his duty, and he understood it. But the anguish behind that duty was real, and it shaped his subsequent handling of the operation in ways that would later draw criticism from some quarters of the Admiralty. After the bombardment, when it emerged that Strasbourg had escaped, the Admiralty briefly considered whether Somerville had been sufficiently aggressive in his pursuit of the French battlecruiser. An official inquiry was convened, Somerville was cleared, but the episode illustrated the impossible position he had occupied. Too compassionate for the hard men who wanted maximum destruction, too dutiful to simply refuse orders he disagreed with. The crews of the Force H ships were not all told, in advance, what they were being sent to do. Accounts from sailors who served aboard HMS Hood and other vessels of the squadron describe a period of mounting, unspoken understanding in the days between leaving Gibraltar and arriving off Mers el-Kébir, a creeping realization. As the destination became clear and the nature of the operation could no longer be obscured, that something unprecedented and deeply uncomfortable was about to happen. Some men were angry at the order, not at the French, whom they had no reason to hate, but at the situation itself, at the logic that had brought them to this place. Others accepted the military necessity with the pragmatic stoicism that wartime naval service tends to produce. A small number, by their own later accounts, felt something close to shame not at their service, not at their ships, but at the world that had produced a situation in which this kind of thing could be necessary. The gunnery crews who operated the main batteries of the capital ships on the afternoon of the 3rd of July performed their duties with the mechanical precision of men who had trained for years for exactly this kind of task. The training, in a sense, was the mercy, because when you are loading and running out and training and firing at the pace of a capital ship's main armament action, there is very little cognitive space for anything beyond the mechanics. The moral weight of what the shells were doing when they crossed the 16 kilometers of water between Force H and the harbour fell most heavily on the officers, the men who could see and assess and understand, rather than on the individual gun crews who were working in noise and heat and the concentrated focus of their stations. That asymmetry of awareness between those who knew what was happening and those who were simply doing their jobs is a feature of all military action. At Mers el-Kébir it had a particular intensity, because everyone involved would eventually have to reckon with the full picture. The aircraft crews from HMS Ark Royal had their own particular experience of the operation. The torpedo bombers and their crews were launched in pursuit of the escaping Strasbourg and in follow-up strikes against the damaged ships in the harbour. Carrier aviation, in 1940, was a physically demanding and dangerous business under any circumstances. The aircraft were relatively slow and vulnerable, the carrier decks were small by later standards, and the operational risks of extended sea patrol were significant. The Ark Royal's crews flew their missions with skill and commitment, and the fact that Strasbourg nevertheless escaped was not for want of effort or courage on their part. In the subsequent months and years of the war, HMS Ark Royal would go on to play a major role in some of the Royal Navy's most significant operations. Her aircraft would be instrumental in the hunt for the German battleship Bismarck, nearly a year later, before she herself was sunk by a German submarine in November of 1941. There is a detail that humanizes the experience of the Force H sailors that deserves to be spoken aloud rather than left in footnotes. In the hours after the bombardment at Mers-el-Kébir, British ships moved through the waters near the harbour, and the crews on deck could see survivors in the water from the sunken Bretagne and the other damaged French vessels. The instinct to render assistance, the deep, old maritime tradition that cuts across national and wartime categories, created an immediate and painful tension. Some British ships did stop to pick up survivors where they could. Others, in the tactical uncertainty of the aftermath, had to keep moving. The French who were rescued by British ships were treated with care. The relationship between the rescuers and the rescued in those hours immediately following the bombardment was, by all accounts, one of genuine human decency on both sides, the kind of decency that had no obvious place in the logic of the previous hours, and yet emerged anyway. This human texture, the anguish of the commanders, the mechanical focus of the gun crews, the terrible moment of recognition when French survivors were seen in the water is not incidental to the history of Operation Catapult. It is, in a very real sense, the history, or at least the dimension of it that most honestly reveals what it means when states make decisions and people have to live inside them. The War Cabinet in London saw a strategic problem and a necessary solution. The men on the ships saw something quite different. They saw other men. And the gap between those two ways of seeing the same event is one of the permanent, unresolved tensions of the story we are telling. Force H continued operating in the Western Mediterranean and Atlantic after Operation Catapult, becoming one of the most active and important command formations in the Royal Navy's order of battle. The force Somerville had assembled in the last days of June 1940 would go on to participate in convoy escort operations, in the attacks on the Italian fleet, in the hunt for the Bismarck, and in the complex naval operations associated with the North African landings. Its story did not end at Mers-el-Kébir. It was, in a sense, born there. But for the men who had been there on the 3rd of July, the harbour at Mers-el-Kébir was never entirely behind them. It was always part of what their service had been, and it always would be. Chapter 9. Charles de Gaulle and the Weight of Two Loyalties. While the guns of Force H were still cooling on the afternoon of the 3rd of July, 1940, a French general sat in London and tried to work out what to say. Charles de Gaulle was 50 years old, a temporary brigadier general who had held a junior ministerial post in Paul Reynaud's government for less than 3 weeks before the armistice ended both his ministry, in his understanding, his country's legitimate claim to sovereignty. He had flown to London on the 18th of June and broadcast an appeal over the BBC calling on French men and women to continue resistance. The broadcast has entered legend. It is one of the defining acts of the entire war. In June of 1940, almost no one heard it. De Gaulle was, at that moment, a nearly unknown figure commanding almost no resources and almost no followers, operating entirely on the strength of his conviction that France had lost a battle but not the war. Mers-el-Kébir placed de Gaulle in an almost unbearably difficult position. The British had just killed more than 1,200 French sailors, men of the same navy, the same uniform, the same republic that he was asking Frenchmen everywhere to continue fighting for. The Vichy propaganda apparatus moved with speed and skill to exploit the massacre, as they chose to call it, framing the British action as proof that the alliance de Gaulle was asking Frenchmen to maintain was worthless, that Britain was willing to murder French sailors the moment it was convenient to do so. In towns and villages across France, and in the French colonies where de Gaulle was desperately trying to build support, Mirz el-Kabir gave Vichy its most powerful single argument against the Gaullist cause. Why die for an ally that does this to you? De Gaulle's response was one of the most politically courageous acts of his life. He went on the BBC again and addressed the French nation about Mirz el-Kabir. He did not minimize the grief or the anger, he acknowledged both, directly and honestly. He did not pretend that what had happened was anything other than a tragedy, but he refused to allow that tragedy to become the conclusion of the story. He argued, in the cadences of a man who had thought the problem through to its foundations, that the British decision, whatever its human cost, reflected the desperate reality of a war that was still ongoing, a war in which the stakes were nothing less than the freedom of every nation in Europe. He asked his listeners not to let the grief of Mirz el-Kabir eclipse the larger truth, that the only path to the liberation of France ran through continuing resistance, not through accommodation with the power that had brought France to its knees. It was an extraordinary performance of political reasoning under emotional pressure. Whether it persuaded many people in France at the time is doubtful. The reach of BBC broadcasts into occupied France in the summer of 1940 was limited, and the Vichy propaganda machine was far better resourced than anything de Gaulle could deploy. But within the small, embattled community of the Free French in London, it set a tone and established a precedent. The movement de Gaulle was building was not going to be destroyed by a single terrible event. However real the grief it caused, the Free French were going to keep going. The relationship between de Gaulle and Churchill in the months after Mirz el-Kabir was, to put it gently, complex. Churchill had enormous respect for de Gaulle's courage and clarity of purpose. He also found him, on a personal level, extraordinarily difficult, stubborn, prickly, quick to take offence, prone to reading insults into perfectly neutral diplomatic communications, and possessed of a pride that sometimes made working with him feel like a contest of wills rather than a partnership. De Gaulle, for his part, understood that Britain was his only real patron, and that without British support the Free French movement could not survive. He also never forgot or forgave the ways in which he felt the British periodically treated the Free French as a useful instrument rather than a genuine ally, ways in which the memory of Mirz el-Kabir was always present as evidence of what Britain was capable of when it felt sufficiently threatened. The Free French movement grew slowly through the summer and autumn of 1940. Individual French officers and sailors, escaping from France or from the colonies or from the chaos of the armistice period, made their way to London in small groups. Some had been caught in British ports when Operation Catapult struck, and had chosen, once the immediate shock passed, to sign on with de Gaulle rather than accept repatriation to France. Others came later, through more circuitous routes. The movement was always small relative to the forces it was trying to represent. The total number of Free French fighters in 1940 was measured in thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but it was not nothing, and its symbolic significance was, from the very beginning, much greater than its military weight. Among those who came to the Free French from the events of Operation Catapult, there were some who had been at Mirz el-Kabir, survivors of the bombardment who nevertheless chose, in the aftermath of a genuinely traumatic experience, to continue fighting alongside the British, rather than return to Vichy France. Their stories are not all documented in detail, the archives of the Free French movement are incomplete, and the individual testimonies of ordinary sailors are particularly sparse, but the fact of their choice is significant. They had every reason to feel betrayal, and some of them felt it acutely. They chose, nonetheless, to look past the event and toward the objective. It is one of the more quietly remarkable features of a situation that contained no easy choices. The question of what Mirz el-Kabir meant for French national memory not in the summer of 1940, but in the decades afterward is one that French historians have approached with a candor that took a long time to develop. For a generation after the war, French public discourse about the events of 1940 was shaped by a broadly Gaullist narrative that emphasized resistance, minimized collaboration, and treated Vichy as an aberration rather than a genuine expression of French political choices. Within that narrative, Mirz el-Kabir was a complicated fit. It was a British atrocity, yes, but one that had been committed in the context of a capitulation by the French government. An honest reckoning with that context required acknowledging things that many French people preferred not to dwell on. It was only from the 1970s onward that French historiography began to engage with Mers el-Kabir and Vichy and the armistice period with the kind of unflinching honesty that the events deserved. De Gaulle himself, in his memoirs, addressed Mers el-Kabir with the particular kind of controlled emotion that characterized his public writing on the most painful subjects. He did not rage. He did not accuse. He described the event in terms that acknowledged its catastrophic human cost, while placing it firmly within the logic of a war that France had not been able to avoid entering. His verdict was not forgiveness. He was too honest for a simple forgiveness narrative, but something more like a clear-eyed acceptance that in the kind of war that the Second World War was, terrible things happened between allies as well as between enemies, and that dwelling on those terrible things could not bring back the dead or reverse the decisions. What it could do, what it was, in a sense, the obligation of those who survived to do was ensure that the sacrifices, whatever their source, were not wasted. In the long story of Operation Catapult, de Gaulle's role is that of the man who absorbed the shock of Mers el-Kabir and refused to be destroyed by it. He took the event that Vichy wanted to use as the final proof of Britain's treachery and transformed it, through sheer force of will and political clarity, into one more reason to keep fighting. It was not a comfortable transformation, and it was not a complete one. The wounds were real and they lasted. But the Free French movement survived Mers el-Kabir, and in surviving it, it demonstrated something important about the resilience of political purpose. When that purpose is grounded not in sentiment or alliance loyalty, but in a genuine understanding of what the alternative looks like. Chapter 10. What Washington Watched. 3,000 miles from the harbour at Mers el-Kabir, in the summer heat of Washington, D.C., a different audience was watching the events of the 3rd of July, 1940, with an attention that was in its own way as intense as anything in London or Vichy or Algiers. The United States of America was not yet in the war. The American public, in the summer of 1940, was deeply divided on the question of whether or not it should be. The isolationist movement, the political tradition that held that American lives and American resources should not be committed to the wars of the old European powers, was not a fringe position. It was a genuine, popular, and politically powerful force, backed by senators and representatives from across the country and by major figures in American public life. Against it stood those who argued that the fall of France and the survival of Britain were matters of vital American interest, that a Europe dominated by a single totalitarian power was a threat to American democracy that could not simply be quarantined by the width of the Atlantic. Franklin Roosevelt was in his second term as president in the summer of 1940, navigating between those two camps with the particular combination of political acuity and strategic vision that defined his leadership. He understood, with a clarity that few in his administration matched, that the survival of Britain was essential to American security. A Britain that surrendered or negotiated a humiliating peace would leave the United States facing a hostile Atlantic and a reconfigured world order that American power was not yet ready to confront alone. The problem was persuading an American public that was exhausted by the memory of the previous war and deeply suspicious of European entanglements, that this time the stakes were genuinely different. Operation Catapult, as an act of British will, landed in Washington with considerable force. Roosevelt and his advisers had been watching Britain since the fall of France with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. Admiration for Churchill's rhetoric and his apparent determination, apprehension about whether that determination would actually translate into effective resistance or would eventually collapse under the pressure of German power. The question that haunted American strategic thinking in the summer of 1940 was simple and brutal. Was Britain going to keep fighting, or was it going to find its own accommodation with Germany? If Britain was going to fight, it was worth supporting. If it was going to surrender, then American resources committed to British survival were simply going to end up in German hands. Mers el-Kabir answered that question with a clarity that no speech or diplomatic assurance could have achieved. A government that was preparing to capitulate does not attack its former allies' fleet. A leadership that is looking for an exit does not order the destruction of a force that might, in a negotiated peace, be offered to Germany as a goodwill gesture. The willingness to do something as costly and as controversial as Operation Catapult to kill more than 1,200 French sailors, to poison the well of Franco-British relations, to hand Vichy and Germany a propaganda gift was, paradoxically, one of the most powerful possible demonstrations that Britain intended to keep fighting, regardless of the cost. Churchill understood this dimension of the operation, and while it was not the primary driver of the decision, it was entirely present in his thinking. American newspaper coverage of Mers el-Kebir was extensive and, in its overall effect, favourable to the British position. Some editorial voices expressed discomfort at the human cost and questioned whether the ultimatum had been genuinely offered in good faith. But the dominant interpretation in the American press was that Britain had demonstrated, in the most dramatic possible terms, that it was serious about the war, that this was a government and a military that understood the stakes and was willing to take genuinely hard decisions to meet them. For American readers who had been uncertain about whether British resistance was sustainable or merely rhetorical, the bombardment of Mers el-Kebir offered a kind of grim reassurance. These people, it said, are actually going to fight. In the White House, Roosevelt moved carefully but decisively in the weeks following Mers el-Kebir. The passage of the Destroyers for Bases Agreement in September of 1940, under which the United States transferred 50 old destroyers to Britain in exchange for leases on British naval bases, was the most visible, early expression of American material support for the British war effort. This agreement was politically controversial in the United States, and the arguments made for it in Congress and in the press drew, explicitly and implicitly, on the evidence that Britain had provided of its determination to fight on. Mers el-Kebir was part of that evidence. The connection was not always stated directly, but it was present in the reasoning of the men who made the case for American support. The American military attaches and naval observers who reported back to Washington from London in the weeks after Operation Catapult noted, in their reports, the particular way that the House of Commons had responded to Churchill's account of the operation, the emotional, sustained cheering that observers described as unlike the usual parliamentary response to even the most dramatic news. This was significant not as a measure of public approval for killing French sailors, but as a measure of something deeper, a nation's recognition that it had a government capable of doing what needed to be done, however terrible the doing of it. American strategic planners filed that recognition carefully. It affected the assessments they made of British staying power. And those assessments, in turn, affected the recommendations they made to Roosevelt about the depth and extent of American commitment to British survival. The neutrality laws that constrained American action in the European War in 1940 were real legal constraints, not merely political obstacles. Roosevelt could not simply send weapons and supplies to Britain as a matter of executive preference. The legal framework governing American neutrality required congressional action or extremely creative legal interpretation. The Lend-Lease Act, which would eventually resolve this problem by allowing the president to lend or lease war materials to any nation whose defense was deemed vital to American security, was not passed until March of 1941. In the interim, the support that the United States could provide was necessarily limited and legally complex. But the direction of travel was set in the summer and autumn of 1940, and the events of the 3rd of July played a role, impossible to precisely quantify but impossible to dismiss, in pointing the compass in that direction. Beyond the immediate politics and strategic calculations, Mers el-Kebir had a longer-term effect on the American understanding of what the Second World War was about. The attack on a former ally by a nation fighting for survival against a totalitarian aggressor raised, in stark and uncomfortable terms, questions about the nature of necessity and the limits of alliance, questions that American policymakers and strategists would themselves have to grapple with as the war progressed and the United States became a belligerent. The pragmatic ruthlessness that Operation Catapult embodied, the willingness to do something genuinely terrible to prevent something potentially worse, was a quality that American leadership would need in quantity as the war went on. Mers el-Kebir was, in this sense, not just a story about Britain. It was a lesson absorbed by Washington in the kind of war that the 20th century had produced. The full arc of American involvement in the Second World War, from cautious neutrality in 1940 to the decisive global commitment of 1942 and beyond, cannot be understood as a simple, linear progression driven by a single cause. Pearl Harbor, the direct Japanese attack on American soil in December of 1941, was the event that brought the United States formally into the war. But the foundations of American commitment to the Allied cause were laid through a long series of events and decisions in 1940 and the early months of 1941, and the bombardment of Mers el-Kabir was one of the stones in that foundation. What it contributed was not sentiment. Americans were not moved to support Britain because they admired the killing of French sailors. What it contributed was credibility, proof of the hardest possible kind that Britain was a nation worth investing in. Chapter 11. The Silent Ships of Toulon. Not every chapter in the story of Operation Catapult was written in a single day. Some of them unfolded slowly, across months and years, in the quiet, watching intervals between the great dramatic events. The story of the French fleet at Toulon is exactly such a chapter, a long, tense, slow-building story of ships sitting at anchor, of admirals and politicians navigating an impossibly narrow passage between competing demands, and of the ultimate fulfillment, in the most dramatic possible circumstances, of a promise that London had refused to believe was worth making. Toulon, on the Mediterranean coast of southern France, was the greatest French naval base, the home of the heavy fleet, the administrative and logistical heart of the Marine Nationale, a city whose identity and economy had been shaped by the presence of the Navy for more than 3 centuries. After the armistice, Toulon sat in the nominally unoccupied zone of France, the half of the country administered by the Vichy government from its quiet spa town headquarters. The ships at Toulon were, therefore, technically on French sovereign territory that Germany had agreed, under the armistice terms, not to occupy. Britain had no legal basis for action at Toulon, and no practical military means to reach it, even if a legal basis had existed. The fleet at Toulon was simply beyond reach, and it was going to remain there until the political geometry of the war shifted. What was in Toulon in the autumn of 1940 was an enormous concentration of naval power. The Strasbourg, which had escaped from Mers el-Kabir, was there. Dozens of cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and auxiliary vessels were there. Over the following 2 years, as the war expanded to encompass the whole globe, those ships sat in the harbour, maintained by their crews, commanded by their officers, watched closely by German armistice commissions, whose role included ensuring that France complied with the terms of the agreement. The German watchers had the authority to inspect but not to control. The ships remained under French command, flying French colours, and the fiction of French naval sovereignty in the harbour at Toulon was maintained, with great care, by both sides. The man most directly responsible for maintaining that fiction was Admiral Jean de Laborde, who commanded the High Seas Fleet at Toulon from 1941 onward. De Laborde was, if anything, even more intensely Anglophobic than Darlan, a naval officer of ferocious pride and absolute commitment to the proposition that the French Navy answered to France and France alone. He implemented Darlan's scuttling orders with meticulous thoroughness, drilling his crews in the procedures that would be required if German forces ever moved to seize the fleet, and making clear to everyone under his command that the order to scuttle, when it came, would be obeyed instantly and completely. For de Laborde, the promise that the fleet would never fall to Germany was not a diplomatic assurance or a political gesture, it was a point of honour, and honour was not negotiable. The test came in November of 1942, when Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa, changed the strategic situation in the Mediterranean in ways that Germany could not ignore. With Allied forces in French North Africa and the political status of French colonial territory suddenly in flux, Hitler ordered the Wehrmacht to move into the previously unoccupied zone of France, eliminating the fiction of Vichy sovereignty in one swift operation. German armoured units rolled south toward Toulon. Their objective was the fleet. The timing of their arrival, in the early morning hours of the 27th of November, 1942, was chosen for maximum surprise. They wanted to reach the harbour before the French could react. They were too late. By a matter of hours, perhaps less, the French crews at Toulon had received their orders and begun the process of destroying their own ships. The scuttling of the French fleet at Toulon was not an instantaneous event, it was a controlled, sequential operation carried out by crews who had rehearsed it and who understood exactly what they were doing and why. Valves were opened, seacocks were released, charges were detonated in engine rooms, and ship after ship began to settle in the harbour. When German troops finally reached the quayside, they found a scene of organised self-destruction ships listing, ships already half submerged, smoke rising, the quiet sounds of sinking hulls and flooding compartments, and French sailors standing on the docks watching their ships go down with expressions that combined grief, pride, and a certain terrible satisfaction. The numbers were staggering. At Toulon, on the 27th of November, 1942, the French Navy scuttled 77 warships, including 3 battleships, 7 cruisers, 15 destroyers, 13 torpedo boats, 6 sloops, 12 submarines, 9 transport vessels, and numerous smaller craft. It was the largest single act of deliberate naval self-destruction in the history of warfare. Germany captured a handful of vessels that could not be scuttled in time, some submarines that were in dry dock and physically could not be flooded, but the core of the fleet, the capital ships and the major combatants, went to the bottom of Toulon harbour in the mud and the grey morning light of that November day. In London, the news from Toulon was received with a complex mixture of emotions. There was relief the nightmare of a German-controlled French fleet, which had driven the decision at Mers-el-Kébir more than 2 years earlier, had been definitively foreclosed. There was something that might have been a grim vindication. Events had proven that the French commanders at Toulon had meant what they said about scuttling. But there was also, in honest minds, an unavoidable question that the scuttling raised. If the French had been willing and able to scuttle at Toulon rather than let their ships fall to Germany, might they not have done the same at Mers-el-Kébir? The argument that British distrust of French promises had been justified could be made. The armistice terms were different, German pressure was different, and the political situation in the summer of 1940 was genuinely more uncertain than it was by November of 1942, but the question lingered, as such questions do. Darlan's standing orders, issued in 1940, maintained through the long intervening years, tested at the ultimate moment in November of 1942, had held. The promise that he had tried to communicate to London, the assurance that had not been believed, or had not been believed sufficiently, had ultimately proved accurate. This does not mean the decision at Mers-el-Kébir was wrong. The moral and strategic logic of the summer of 1940 was shaped by uncertainties that no longer existed by the time of the Toulon scuttling. But it does mean that the story was not as simple as it appeared in the immediate aftermath of the bombardment, and that honest history requires acknowledging all of it, the necessity, the cost, and the ultimate validation of the promise that came too late to change anything. The physical recovery of the Toulon fleet would take years. Some hulls were raised and scrapped during the war, others were not salvaged until long afterward. The harbour itself bore the marks of the scuttling for a generation. And in the institutional memory of the French Navy, the 27th of November, 1942 joined the 3rd of July, 1940, as one of the dates that defined what the service had been through in its worst years, not defeats in the normal sense, because no enemy had defeated the ships at Toulon, but losses nonetheless. Losses that were chosen, that were honourable by the logic of the men who made them, and that left a wound in the soul of the institution that was not easily healed. Chapter 12. Parliament, Propaganda, and the Performance of Resolve. 2 days after the guns fell silent at Mers-el-Kébir, Winston Churchill rose in the House of Commons to give an account of what had happened. It was the 4th of July, 1940, a date whose irony could not have been entirely lost on the American correspondents in the press gallery, reporting on one democracy's most controversial act of the war on the same day that another democracy celebrated its founding. The chamber was full. Members who had not been there for a routine session had made their way to Westminster specifically to hear what Churchill would say, and the galleries were packed with observers who understood that this was going to be one of the defining parliamentary moments of the war. Churchill's speech on the 4th of July was not his most famous. It did not contain the soaring rhetorical passages that have passed into anthology. What it contained, instead, was something harder and in some ways more impressive. A clear, unflinching account of a difficult decision, delivered without apology, without evasion, and without the kind of sentimental softening that might have made it easier to hear, but would have made it less truthful. Churchill told the House what had been decided and why. He described the ultimatum, the negotiations, the failure to reach agreement, and the subsequent bombardment. He acknowledged the loss of French life. He did not pretend that what had happened was painless or uncomplicated. And then he told Parliament, with the full weight of a Prime Minister in a nation at war, that the decision had been necessary and that he accepted complete responsibility for it. The response of the House of Commons was remarkable, and not in the way that a modern reader might expect. Members did not cheer the destruction of the French fleet as a military triumph. What they cheered, and the cheering was described by observers as the most emotional outpouring they had seen in the chamber during the entire war, was something different. They were cheering a government that had shown it was capable of making the hardest possible choice. They were cheering a Prime Minister who stood up and said, in plain language, that this is what we have done, and this is why, and here is my name on the decision. After years of appeasement and evasion, and the carefully constructed deniabilities of interwar politics, the House of Commons was responding to something it recognized as genuine, a leadership that was actually governing, actually deciding, actually accountable. However terrible the decision, the capacity to make it and own it was itself something worth recognizing. The German and Italian propaganda machines moved with predictable speed to exploit the news from Mers el-Kébir. German broadcasts to France and to French colonial territories emphasized the betrayal of French honor by British aggression, the murder of French sailors by an ally that had shown its true colors. Vichy's own propaganda output was, if anything, even more intense. Mers el-Kébir was presented as the definitive proof that the armistice had been the only rational choice, that France had been right to step back from a partnership that had always been, at its core, an expression of British imperial interest rather than genuine solidarity. The image of the British fleet firing on French ships became one of the central visual and rhetorical arguments of Vichy's case against the Free French and against continued resistance. For the Gaullist resistance, responding to this propaganda was one of the central challenges of the months that followed Mers el-Kébir. The problem was not simply that the Vichy argument was powerful, though it was, but that it was grounded in an event that had genuinely happened, whose human cost was genuinely devastating, and whose justification required a level of strategic and political reasoning that was not easily compressed into the format of a radio broadcast or a leaflet. De Gaulle and his colleagues in London worked to develop a counter-narrative that acknowledged the tragedy, while placing it in the context of a larger truth, the truth that the war was not over, and that the only path to French liberation ran through continued resistance, not through the accommodation that Vichy was offering. How effective this counter-narrative was, in the face of a sophisticated Vichy propaganda operation, is genuinely difficult to measure, but the effort was sustained, and it contributed to the gradual, painfully, frustratingly gradual growth of the Free French movement. In Britain itself, the domestic reaction to Mers el-Kébir was more nuanced than the parliamentary scene might suggest. Public opinion polling, which was in its early days in Britain in 1940, but was being conducted with increasing sophistication by the government and by private organisations, suggested that the British public broadly supported the decision, a finding that is perhaps unsurprising given the immediate existential stakes of the war, the fear of German invasion, and the specific terror that a German-controlled naval superpower would have represented. But there was also a significant minority who felt uncomfortable with the action, who expressed sorrow at the loss of French life, and who questioned whether the ultimatum had been a genuine offer or merely the procedural cover for a decision that had already been made. That discomfort was real, and it was recorded, and it is part of the honest history of the event. The role of media and communication in shaping the reception of Operation Catapult was more complex than the binary of British approval versus French outrage suggests. Neutral nations, particularly the United States, but also those in South America, in the Middle East, and elsewhere, formed their own assessments of the event, and those assessments were shaped by the quality and credibility of the information available to them. British diplomatic communications worked hard to ensure that the official British account of the negotiations preceding the bombardment, the ultimatum, the options offered, the time allowed, the decision to fire only when those options were rejected, was the version that reached neutral capitals first and in the greatest detail. Whether this represented a fair account of what had actually happened at Mers-el-Kébir, or whether it selectively emphasized those aspects that most clearly justified British action, is a question that historians have explored carefully and answered with varying degrees of generosity to the British position. Churchill's own management of the parliamentary and public narrative around Mers-el-Kébir was, by any assessment, masterful, and this is true even for those who have questioned the decision itself. He gave an honest, direct, fully accountable account of events. He did not hide behind collective responsibility or ministerial deniability. He connected the specific action to the larger strategic purpose in terms that were accessible to parliamentarians and, through the press, to the public. And he absorbed the grief and discomfort that the event generated without allowing it to become a reason to question whether Britain would keep fighting. The performance of resolve, and it was a performance in the theatrical sense, because all public speech as a performance was itself a strategic act. Enemies watching from Berlin and Rome, and friends watching from Washington, saw a prime minister who owned his decisions and whose grip on his country's direction was, after Mers-el-Kébir, considerably harder to doubt. The longer-term effects on British wartime propaganda of the Mers-el-Kébir decision were interesting and not entirely predictable. In the short term, the event was handled as what it was, a difficult but necessary action, explained and defended in straightforward terms. Over time, as the narrative of Britain's wartime heroism was consolidated into the cultural memory of the 1940s and beyond, Mers-el-Kébir tended to be somewhat marginalized in the popular account, not hidden or denied, but not celebrated either. It was an uncomfortable chapter in a story that Britain preferred to tell in terms of defense, resilience, and eventual triumph. The bombing of civilians, the destruction of alliance friendships, the killing of former comrades, these dimensions of the war did not fit comfortably into the heroic template, and Mers-el-Kébir, with all its moral ambiguity, was not the story that anyone wanted to lead with. French historical engagement with Mers-el-Kébir followed its own complicated trajectory. For a generation after the war, the event was present in French consciousness as an injury real, documented, not forgotten, but it sat uneasily alongside the larger story that post-war France wanted to tell about itself. The Gaullist story of resistance and liberation. Engaging fully and honestly with Mers-el-Kébir required engaging honestly with the armistice, with Vichy, with collaboration, and with the choices that ordinary French men and women had made in the summer of 1940. Those were conversations that France was not yet ready to have in the 1950s and early 1960s. When they did come, and they came in full, uncomfortable force, from the 1970s onward, through the work of historians and filmmakers who were willing to look at the whole picture, Mers-el-Kébir was part of the reckoning. The 4th of July, 1940 remains, in the calendar of the Second World War, a date whose significance extends well beyond the parliamentary record of one famous speech. It marks the moment when the account was given, when the decision was placed before the democratic institution that had authorized the government making it, and when the response of that institution said something that reverberated across every allied and neutral capital on earth. Not celebration, not approval, but recognition of a government that was, in the fullest and most demanding sense of the word, governing. That recognition, in the darkest summer of the 20th century, was worth more than almost anything else that a parliamentary session could have produced. We are halfway through the full history of Operation Catapult, and you have stayed with us through every chapter. The story ahead is extraordinary. It takes us through the long shadow of Mers-el-Kébir over the rest of the war, through the meetings between former adversaries, through the slow and complicated healing of an alliance that had been broken, and through the final reckoning with what the summer of 1940 actually meant for the course of human history. We will be here with you for all of it, at this same slow, steady pace. If this documentary is useful to you tonight, we would love to hear from you in the comments. A simple hello, or wherever you are listening from, means more than you might think. Rest well, we will keep going. Chapter 13, The Second Strike and the Unfinished Business. There is a particular cruelty to unfinished business in wartime. A battle that has been fought but not concluded, a threat that has been reduced but not eliminated, an enemy or, in this case, a former ally that has been struck but not fully neutralized. The events of the 3rd of July, 1940, at Mers el-Kabir left exactly this kind of unfinished business on the table. The Strasbourg had escaped, the Dunkirk was damaged but not destroyed. And the broader question of whether the actions of that single day were sufficient to achieve the strategic purpose they had been designed to serve remained, in the days immediately following the bombardment, genuinely unresolved. Admiral Somerville knew that the escape of Strasbourg was a significant failure. The battlecruiser was fast, modern, and heavily armed, and her presence at Toulon, where she arrived safely several days after the bombardment, represented exactly the kind of residual threat that Operation Catapult had been designed to eliminate. The Admiralty in London was concerned, and the signals exchanged between Somerville and his superiors in the days after the 3rd of July reflected a mixture of frustration, inquiry, and the kind of careful institutional pressure that senior naval commands apply when they believe an operational objective has not been fully achieved. Somerville argued, with documentation, that the pursuit had been conducted with the resources available under the circumstances, that the time window had been constrained by factors beyond his control, and that the escape of Strasbourg, while regrettable, did not reflect a failure of command judgment. The inquiry that followed cleared him, but the episode left its mark. The incomplete neutralization of the Dunkirk created a second set of problems in the days following the bombardment. Damage assessments conducted by the British from aerial observation and from intelligence sources indicated that the French battlecruiser, while beached and out of immediate action, was not destroyed beyond repair. The French were working to stabilize the ship and, if possible, to patch her wounds sufficiently to allow her to be moved to a more secure location, ideally Toulon, where the main body of the fleet was concentrated and where British aircraft could not easily reach. If Dunkirk was repaired and sent to Toulon, the balance of power that the bombardment of the 3rd of July had been designed to alter would be partially restored. London was acutely aware of this possibility, and the question of whether to mount a second strike against the damaged battlecruiser occupied the Admiralty for the better part of a week. The decision was made to strike again. On the 6th of July, 1940, aircraft from HMS Ark Royal were launched in a further attack on the Mers el-Kabir harbour area, targeting specifically the damaged Dunkirk and the vessels still present in the anchorage. This second attack was a complex operation. The harbour defences had been reinforced since the bombardment, the French crews were alert, and the operational conditions were demanding. The result was an outcome that illustrated, with painful precision, the sometimes savage unpredictability of warfare. One of the torpedoes from the British aircraft struck not a warship, but a patrol vessel, a small ship being used as a tender that was moored alongside the Dunkirk. That vessel was carrying survivors from the original bombardment, men who had been rescued from the Bretagne and other damaged ships and were being accommodated aboard the tender, while arrangements for their transfer ashore were completed. The explosion killed more than 150 men who had survived the first attack only to die in the second. The deaths on the 6th of July added a layer of tragedy to the already terrible arithmetic of Mers el-Kabir. These were men who had survived one British attack, who were not combat personnel in any active sense at that moment, and who died in circumstances that reflected the fundamental unpredictability of warfare rather than any deliberate targeting decision. The French treated the event with the horror that it deserved. The British, when the full picture became clear, were not without their own anguish at what the attack had produced. The operational logic had been straightforward: prevent Dunkirk from being repaired and moved. The human cost of executing that logic had once again exceeded what anyone had wished. The damaged battlecruiser herself survived the second attack, was eventually repaired over a period of months, and was later moved to Toulon, arriving there in early 1942, somewhat ironic vindication of the Vichy argument that France could manage its own fleet without British intervention. Beyond the physical actions in Algerian waters, the days following the bombardment saw a flurry of diplomatic activity that illustrated how many different fronts the consequences of Operation Catapult were being managed on simultaneously. In Vichy, the French government was processing the political fallout and making decisions about the extent of its response, the break in diplomatic relations with Britain, the retaliatory air attacks on Gibraltar, and the tone of public communications about the event. In London, the Foreign Office was engaged in the careful, necessary work of managing the impressions of neutral governments, ensuring that the British account of the negotiations preceding the bombardment reached the relevant capitals and was received as credible. In Alexandria, Admiral Cunningham was navigating the delicate aftermath of the arrangement he had reached with Godefroy, ensuring that the immobilized French squadron remained stable and that no secondary crisis developed out of the tensions of the 3rd of July. In the colonies, the political consequences were playing out in ways that were difficult to predict and even more difficult to manage. The French colonial empire stretched across West Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, the Pacific, and the Caribbean, was a mosaic of different political loyalties, different personal histories, and different assessments of which direction offered France the better future. Some colonial governors and military commanders inclined toward the Free French and de Gaulle. Others inclined toward Vichy and accommodation. Mers el-Kébir did not simplify these calculations, it complicated them. The British attack gave the pro-Vichy argument its strongest single piece of evidence. In territories that were genuinely balanced between the two options, the news from Mers el-Kébir tipped some of them toward Vichy and away from the Allied cause for months or years. The consequences played out in subsequent operations, most notably the failed Allied attempt to land at Dakar in September of 1940, an operation whose failure was shaped in part by the degree to which Mers el-Kébir had hardened French colonial resistance to cooperation with Britain. The September of 1940 operation, at Dakar Operation Menace, as it was officially designated, was intended to deliver a substantial Free French and British force to West Africa and secure the colony of French West Africa for the de Gaulle cause. The intelligence available to the Allies suggested that the governor of Dakar might be open to negotiation and that a show of force, combined with a sincere offer of cooperation, might produce the desired outcome without significant fighting. Instead, the French forces at Dakar resisted with a determination that surprised the Allies, and that was, by the accounts of participants on both sides, fueled in no small part by the memory of what had happened at Mers el-Kébir 10 weeks earlier. The operation was called off after several days of inconclusive and costly fighting. It was one of the more significant failures of Allied strategy in the early war period, and Mers el-Kébir's shadow lay directly across it. The interplay between the events of the 3rd of July and the subsequent trajectory of Allied strategy in the French colonial world is one of the less examined but genuinely important dimensions of the Operation Catapult story. The decision to strike the French fleet had been made on the basis of a very specific strategic calculation to prevent the fleet from falling to Germany. That calculation was sound within its own frame, but it was made without full accounting for the second-order effects on French colonial political loyalties, and those second-order effects were real, persistent, and sometimes very costly. The failure at Dakar in September of 1940 is the most concrete example, but it was not the only one. Every Allied diplomatic effort in French North Africa, every attempt to persuade French colonial commanders to switch their allegiance to the Allied cause, every negotiation with Vichy officials about the political future of the empire took place under the shadow of what the British had done at Mers el-Kébir. The shadow was manageable. It was never entirely absent. What the unfinished business of Operation Catapult ultimately reveals is a truth about military decisions that is easy to state but difficult to fully absorb. The consequences of force are never fully contained within the tactical or strategic frame in which the decision to use force was made. Mers el-Kabir was designed to solve a specific problem, the threat of the French fleet, and in that specific sense, it largely worked. But it also created new problems, new complications, new obstacles that had to be navigated for the remainder of the war. The history of those complications, which continued well past the summer of 1940 and well past the scuttling at Toulon in November of 1942, is the history of what it means to make a genuinely consequential decision in wartime and then have to live with its consequences across the years that follow. That is the subject of the chapters that remain. Chapter 14. The Long Shadow over North Africa. If there is a single theatre of the Second World War where the consequences of Operation Catapult were most consistently and most visibly present across the full span of the conflict, it is North Africa. The great rolling narrative of the Desert War, the campaigns that swept back and forth across Libya and Egypt, the fall of Tobruk, the battles of El Alamein, and eventually the Allied landings that cleared the African continent of Axis forces was shaped, at critical moments, by the political complexities that Mers el-Kabir had introduced into the relationship between Britain and the French colonial world. To understand that shaping, we need to trace the thread of French North African politics from the summer of 1940 through to the autumn of 1942, when the Allied landings finally resolved what the bombardment had left unresolved. French North Africa in the summer of 1940 meant three territories: Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Together, they formed a vast, strategically critical region whose ports, airfields, and overland routes were of enormous importance to the control of the central Mediterranean. The French military forces in those territories were substantial, several 100,000 men equipped and trained to a reasonable standard, occupying some of the most geographically significant ground in the entire theatre. If those forces had been available to the Allies from the beginning of the war, the strategic situation in the Mediterranean and North Africa would have been fundamentally different. But those forces were, after the armistice, under Vichy authority, and Vichy authority meant, at least in the first years of the conflict, loyalty to the French government rather than to the Allied cause. The commanders of French North Africa after the armistice were a complex collection of individuals with varying degrees of enthusiasm for Vichy, varying degrees of personal bitterness about the British, and varying degrees of private sympathy for the Allied cause. General Maxime Weygand, who served as Delegate General for French Africa from late 1940 until 1941, was a conservative military figure whose distaste for the Germans was genuine, but whose commitment to French sovereignty under Vichy was equally genuine. Weygand had no intention of delivering North Africa to the Germans. He maintained a version of French military independence in the region that annoyed both Vichy and Berlin, but neither did he have any intention of delivering it to the British or to de Gaulle. The experience of Mers el-Kabir, which Weygand regarded as an act of British aggression against the French state, reinforced his determination to maintain a distance from London. He was eventually removed under German pressure, but his period in command illustrated the complex politics that Britain had to navigate in the region. Allied intelligence about French North Africa in the period between the armistice and Operation Torch was extensive and sophisticated. A network of American diplomatic contacts, maintained through the United States consular presence in the region, American officers posted to North Africa under diplomatic cover, whose real function was intelligence gathering and political assessment, provided Washington and, through Washington, London, with detailed information about the political attitudes of French commanders, about the state of French military forces, and about the degree to which cooperation might be achievable if the right approach were made and the right assurances offered. These contacts were invaluable, and the relationships built through them would be essential to the planning of Operation Torch. But they also made clear, again and again, that the memory of Mers el-Kabir was a persistent obstacle, a scar in the institutional memory of the French military in North Africa, that any successful Allied approach would need to account for and work around. The planning of Operation Torch, the Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria that took place in November of 1942, was shaped, in significant ways, by the lessons of Mers el-Kebir and the political complications it had created. The British, specifically, were aware that their presence as the lead power in any landing operation would likely harden French resistance, given the degree to which anti-British sentiment among French military commanders in North Africa had been reinforced by the events of the 3rd of July. The solution that emerged from Allied planning was to give the operation a predominantly American face. General Eisenhower commanded the operation. American forces were the most visible element of the landing force, and the communications to French commanders preceding the landings emphasized the American rather than the British dimension of the Allied effort. This was not a small tactical adjustment, it was a major organizational decision driven directly by an assessment of the political damage that Mers el-Kebir had done to British credibility in French North Africa. The landings on the 8th of November, 1942, went forward across multiple beaches in Morocco and Algeria simultaneously. French resistance varied dramatically from location to location. Some units fought hard, others surrendered quickly. Some individual commanders made private accommodations with the Allies, while publicly maintaining the fiction of Vichy loyalty. The most significant and consequential single event of the political dimension of the landings was the encounter between the Allied command and Admiral Darlan, who, as mentioned in an earlier chapter, happened to be in Algiers at the time of the landings, visiting his ill son. Darlan's decision, in the immediate aftermath of the landings, to order a ceasefire and then to cooperate with the Allied command in exchange for recognition as the senior French authority in North Africa, was one of the most pragmatically necessary and morally uncomfortable decisions of the entire Allied conduct of the war. The Darlan deal, as it was quickly and derisively labelled, drew immediate and fierce criticism from those who believed that the Allies were legitimizing a collaborationist official in exchange for short-term military convenience. De Gaulle, in London, was furious, not only because the deal bypassed him and the Free French, but because it seemed to repudiate everything that the resistance movement had stood for since the summer of 1940. Churchill was deeply uncomfortable with it, though he recognized its military necessity. Eisenhower defended it on purely pragmatic grounds. Darlan could stop the French fighting with a single order in a way that no one else could, and saving Allied lives in the immediate term justified the political cost. The debate about whether that justification was sufficient has never been entirely resolved, and in some ways it is the same debate, in a different form, as the debate about Mers el-Kebir itself, whether military necessity can justify actions whose moral cost is very high. Darlan's assassination on the 24th of December, 1942, removed the immediate problem of the deal and removed Darlan himself from the historical stage with the kind of sudden, dramatic finality that the lives of major historical figures sometimes produce. His assassin was a young French royalist named Fernand Bonnier de la Chapelle, who appears to have been connected to both Gaullist and other resistance networks, and who was tried and executed within 48 hours of the assassination. The speed of that trial and execution, and the subsequent revelation that Bonnier de la Chapelle had been told he would be pardoned, created a shadow of conspiracy around the killing that has never been fully dispelled. What is clear is that Darlan's death resolved the political impasse of the deal and opened the way for the gradual unification of French military forces in North Africa under a leadership structure that was more compatible with the Allied command and more acceptable to de Gaulle. The liberation of French North Africa from Axis control, completed in May of 1943, with the surrender of the last German and Italian forces in Tunisia, marks the end of the direct military phase of the story that Mers el-Kebir had helped to shape. From that point forward, the French military, the Free French, the former Vichy forces that had switched sides, the repatriated officers and men who had made their various choices in the complicated years since the armistice were fighting as a unified force alongside the British and Americans. The integration was not smooth or painless. The institutional memories of the different factions, the personal grievances, the wounds that Mers el-Kebir had opened and that subsequent events had sometimes deepened and sometimes started to heal, were all present in the command structures and the interpersonal dynamics of the combined force. But the fighting was being done together, and that fact, which would have seemed barely conceivable in the summer of 1940, was itself an extraordinary testament to the resilience of political purpose when survival and liberation are the stakes. The North African chapter of the Operation Catapult story ends, as so much of the war ends, not with a clear resolution, but with a complicated ledger. Mers el-Kébir had cost Britain a great deal in political capital in French North Africa. It had hardened resistance, delayed cooperation, and contributed to failures Dakar in 1940, the slow political evolution in Algeria and Morocco that had real costs in time and lives. At the same time, the strategic purpose it served, preventing the French fleet from becoming a German asset, had contributed to the survival of British sea power in the critical years before American support became decisive. Both of those things are true. The ledger does not balance neatly. Real history never does. Chapter 15. The Sailors Who Survived. The grand arc of political and strategic history has a tendency to absorb the individual, to fold the personal into the institutional, to replace the specific human voice with the measured cadence of the historical account. The story of Operation Catapult has that tendency as much as any story from the Second World War. It is so large, so politically charged, so intellectually and strategically interesting, that the individual men inside it can easily disappear. This chapter is an attempt to prevent that disappearance for a little while longer, to slow down, to look, as specifically as we can, at the lives of the men who were there, the survivors of the Bretagne, the officers of the Dunkirk, the sailors who swam in the oil-darkened waters of Mers el-Kébir harbour on the afternoon of the 3rd of July, 1940, and to ask what the rest of the war and the rest of their lives looked like from where they stood. The survivors of the Bretagne were, almost without exception, men who had gone through one of the most traumatic experiences that a sailor can face, the sudden, catastrophic loss of a capital ship in combat conditions, with minimal warning and no time for an orderly abandonment. The Bretagne capsized quickly. The mechanics of her sinking were brutal in the way that the loss of a large warship always is the enormous hull turning over, the men trapped below decks with no possibility of escape, the few who were on the upper decks or in positions near the exterior of the ship managing to get clear before the hull went under. Those who survived were in the water in a harbour that was, despite the cessation of British fire, still a scene of chaos and danger, with other ships under attack, secondary explosions, and the general confusion of a naval action in the immediate aftermath. Being in the water in those conditions, with no certainty about whether the firing was truly over, and with the smoke and noise and the physical shock of having survived a catastrophe, was an experience that left permanent marks. The medical care available to the wounded was stretched immediately beyond its capacity. The port facilities at Mers el-Kébir and the nearby city of Oran were mobilized to receive casualties, and French naval medical personnel worked through the night of the 3rd of July and for days afterward. The wounded included men with burns, men with blast injuries, men with injuries from debris, and men in the kind of dissociated psychological state that acute combat trauma produces and that the medical vocabulary of 1940 had only the most rudimentary language to describe. The concept of what we would now call post-traumatic stress was not well understood in 1940. What happened to many of the men who survived the Bretagne and the other stricken vessels, the nightmares, the difficulty returning to duty, the changed relationships with everything that had come before was observed and noted by their commanders and their medical officers, but the institutional response available to address it was limited. Many of those men simply carried what they had been through with them for the rest of their lives, without ever having a language for it or access to help in the way that later generations would understand as appropriate. Among the survivors who stayed in the French Navy under Vichy, the experience of the 3rd of July shaped their service in ways that varied enormously from individual to individual. Some became deeply hostile to Britain and deeply committed to Vichy, their personal trauma reinforcing a political position that framed the event as British betrayal. Others, even among those who had been in the water at Mers el-Kébir, reached different conclusions. The same event, experienced from the same ships, produced a range of political and moral responses that defied any simple generalization about what survivors felt and why. Among those who eventually made their way to the Free French, there were indeed men who had survived the 3rd of July and who chose, later in the war, to rejoin the fight alongside the British, a choice that required them to set aside, or at least to contain, the personal experience of what had happened in that harbour. The crews of the Dunkirk and the Provence, the battle cruiser and the battleship that were damaged but not sunk in the bombardment, had a somewhat different experience than the survivors of the Bretagne, because they were dealing not with immediate personal survival, but with the slower, less acute trauma of having been in a naval action against a former ally and having come out of it with their ships damaged but still afloat. For these men, the immediate aftermath was one of damage control, casualty management, and the absorption of what had happened. Dunkirk's crew worked frantically to keep their ship from sinking, to move her to a position where she could be beached safely, and to begin the process of assessing the damage and planning for repair. These are, in the context of naval warfare, entirely normal activities, the ordinary work of keeping a warship alive after a battle. What was not ordinary was the identity of the force that had damaged them. The French naval personnel who were in British ports when Operation Catapult was executed on the 3rd of July faced a quite different set of choices and circumstances. They were, in effect, suddenly prisoners, or at least detainees, in a country that had just attacked their navy, held in ships or in shore accommodation while the British government worked out what to do with them, and while they worked out what they wanted to do with themselves. The choice offered to them, eventually, was a version of the same choice that the ultimatum at Mers el-Kébir had offered: join the Free French and continue fighting, or accept repatriation to France. The majority chose repatriation. A minority chose the Free French. The proportions varied by ship and by the particular circumstances of capture, but the overall balance leaned heavily toward going home, which tells us something real about the degree to which Mers el-Kébir had damaged the credibility of the British offer among French naval personnel who had experienced the event directly. For those who chose repatriation, the journey home was frequently long and complicated, routed through neutral countries or by sea lanes that required careful navigation of the new political geography of a Europe divided between occupied and nominally independent zones. Men who had been serving their country honourably in a war against fascism found themselves being transported home to a France that was, under Vichy, in a complicated accommodation with the very power they had been fighting. The psychological adjustment required by that situation, the passage from fighting ally to honourable but now functionally inactive serviceman in a collaborationist state, was one that many of them never fully resolved. Some went on to serve Vichy, some gradually made their way to the resistance. Some simply tried to live their lives as quietly as possible in a situation that offered no clean choices. The French sailors who chose the Free French on the 3rd of July and in the weeks immediately following were, by the accounts available, a group defined less by any simple political conviction than by a particular combination of temperament, circumstance, and in some cases, personal relationships with specific officers or with the Gaullist cause. Some had been following de Gaulle's broadcasts and were already inclined toward resistance before the events of the 3rd of July. Others made their decision in the immediate aftermath of the British action, a decision that, in those circumstances, required a significant act of will, the ability to separate a just cause from the unjust act that had just been committed in its name. These men contributed, in their various capacities, to the growth of the Free French naval forces, the forces Navales Françaises Libres, which, over the course of the war, grew from a tiny initial cadre into a significant fighting force that played a real role in the Allied naval effort. The long-term lives of the men who had been at Mers el-Kébir, those who survived into the post-war period, were marked in ways that are difficult to generalize but impossible to dismiss. For many of them, the 3rd of July, 1940 remained the central event of their service, the thing they were most often asked about and the thing they found most difficult to explain to those who had not been there. The experience of being attacked by an ally, of going through the specific psychological transition from Allied sailor to target within the space of a few hours, was not something that the subsequent years of the war or of peacetime erased. The men who had served on the Bretagne and survived, or on the Dunkirk, or who had been in British ports when the seizures happened, carried the 3rd of July with them for the rest of their lives as a reference point against which everything else was measured. When the survivors met in the post-war reunions that French naval veterans held through the 1950s, 60s and beyond, the 3rd of July was present in the room in the way that defining experiences are always present in the rooms where the people who shared them gather. Not always spoken, not always the explicit subject of conversation, but there, in the particular silences, in the specific way certain topics were approached or avoided, in the bond between men who had been in the water together or on the same damaged deck together, and who needed no explanation of what that meant. The historian who reads the records of those reunions and the accounts left by the men who attended them gets a sense of how deeply the event had rooted itself in the personal histories of those who had lived through it. Mers el-Kabir was not simply a chapter in a war. For those men, it was a chapter in their lives, the kind of chapter that everything else in those lives was, in some way, written in relation to. Chapter 16. Allies Across the Wound. The process by which France and Britain rebuilt their relationship after Mers el-Kabir was long, incomplete, and conducted mostly in the spaces between larger events rather than as a deliberate project of reconciliation. There was no single moment, no formal ceremony, no agreed date on which the wound was declared healed and the alliance restored to something resembling its pre-war condition. What happened instead was a gradual, uneven, sometimes backsliding process of working together, despite the injury of finding, through the shared experience of fighting the same war toward the same end, a functional working relationship that eventually, over years, began to shade back towards something warmer than mere utility. Churchill and de Gaulle, the two figures who most powerfully represented their respective nations' wartime, will had one of the most famously difficult relationships in the entire history of the Allied coalition. Their disagreements were numerous, their confrontations sometimes intense, their mutual frustration at times nearly complete. Churchill, who had genuine admiration for de Gaulle's courage and genuine affection for France as a country and a culture, found the general's pride and his apparent determination to read insult into every British decision maddening. De Gaulle, who needed British support to survive and knew it, resented that dependency even as he drew on it, and was never entirely able to separate his appreciation of individual acts of British support from his awareness of the ways in which Britain could and did treat the Free French as a means rather than an end. Their relationship was, nonetheless, a working one. They continued to meet, to communicate, to coordinate. The shared purpose was real even when the personal relationship was strained almost to breaking. The shared experience of the North African campaign, and particularly of the period from the Allied landings in November of 1942 onward, began to create new bonds between French and British military personnel that gradually overlaid the older wounds. Officers and men who fought together in Tunisia, who planned together, who shared the same hardships and the same risks, developed the kind of personal trust that military partnership at the operational level generates in a way that political decisions, however reasonable or unreasonable, cannot easily replicate. The French forces that fought in the final stages of the North African campaign, and then in Sicily, and then in Italy, and then in the liberation of France itself, were building a new record of shared sacrifice that was, over time, more real and more present to the soldiers involved than the memory of what had happened in an Algerian harbour in the summer of 1940. The liberation of France in the summer of 1944, the great campaign that began with the landings in Normandy on the 6th of June and culminated in the liberation of Paris in late August, was, among its many dimensions, a moment of profound symbolic importance for the Franco-British relationship. British forces fought alongside French forces across the same French countryside where, 4 years earlier, the collapse of the Allied armies had led to the armistice and everything that followed from it. The emotional weight of that shared campaign of British soldiers fighting for the liberation of a country they had been forced to leave in shambles 4 years before, alongside French soldiers returning to their own country to drive out its occupiers, was enormous and was felt by the participants in ways that left lasting impressions. The shared experience of that campaign did not erase Mers el-Kabir, but it added to the account something that the account had previously lacked: the memory of fighting together, successfully, toward a shared and meaningful goal. The formal restoration of France as a major Allied power, marked by de Gaulle's triumphant entry into Paris on the 25th of August, 1944, was a moment that Churchill attended with complex emotions. He visited Paris in November of 1944, walking with de Gaulle down the Champs-Élysées, before enormous crowds in a scene that both men understood as something more than a diplomatic visit. It was a demonstration, as visible and as public as anything either of them had produced, that the alliance between France and Britain had survived the war's most terrible tests, including the test of Mers el-Kabir. The crowds that turned out to cheer both leaders were not wrong to feel that something had been restored. Something had been. Whether it was the same thing that had existed before the armistice, or something different, harder, more knowing, more realistic about what allies were capable of doing to each other under sufficient pressure, is a question that those who participated in the moment would have answered in various ways. The post-war reconstruction of the Franco-British relationship proceeded through the institutions of the new European and Atlantic Order, through NATO, through the various frameworks of European cooperation that began to emerge in the late 1940s and 1950s, through the ongoing military partnerships that kept French and British forces working alongside each other across a range of theatres and operations. These institutional structures created new habits of cooperation, new personal relationships, new shared experiences that accumulated over the years and decades in ways that gradually shifted the emotional center of gravity of the relationship. The memory of Mers el-Kabir did not disappear from that relationship. It is still present, referenced in French discussions of British reliability as an ally, whenever those discussions become sufficiently frank. But it became one historical data point among many, rather than the defining characterization of what the relationship was. There were specific acts of formal reconciliation that deserve note. In 1944, and in the years immediately following the liberation, surviving French veterans of Mers el-Kabir and British veterans of Force H sometimes encountered each other in liberated ports, in official ceremonies, in the informal mixing of Allied forces that the end of active operations produced. The accounts of those encounters that have been recorded suggest that they were, in general, characterized by the kind of careful human dignity that the participants clearly felt was owed to the experience they had shared. Former enemies, which is the wrong word, but there is no right word for what they had been to each other on the 3rd of July, 1940, finding, in the changed world of 1945 and beyond, that the larger category of shared humanity contained enough room for both of them. The formal ceremonies of commemoration that were held at Mers el-Kabir in subsequent decades, first on French initiative, later with British participation, provided another kind of reckoning. The process of standing together at the site of the event, of honouring the dead in a way that acknowledged both the loss and the context, of finding shared language for something that was, in its own way, as complicated as almost any event in the two nations' long shared history, was not simple or free of tension, but it happened. It continued to happen. The ceremonies were not triumphant or celebratory, they were, appropriately, solemn and honest. And the fact that they happened at all, that British and French officers and veterans eventually stood together at Mers el-Kabir and acknowledged what the harbour had witnessed, is itself a form of resolution, incomplete, imperfect, but real. The story of how allies manage the wounds they inflict on each other is, ultimately, a story about the durability of shared interest and shared values in the face of the worst that shared history can produce. Mers el-Kabir was, by most assessments, among the worst things that Britain did to France in the entire course of their long and complicated shared history. Worse, certainly, than many of the colonial competitions and diplomatic frictions that had preceded it. And yet the alliance, in its various forms, survived. It survived because the shared interest was real and because the values, democracy, the rule of law, the belief that the freedom of nations is worth defending at cost were genuinely shared. Those things did not make Mers el-Kabir easier to bear, but they were strong enough, over time, to carry the relationship past it. Chapter 17: History's Verdict and Its Complications. The judgment of history on Operation Catapult has never been settled, and it probably never will be. That unsettledness is not a failure of historical method. It reflects the genuine moral complexity of the event itself, a complexity that resists the kind of clean resolution that makes historical judgments comfortable. What we can do, having followed the story through its full arc from the fall of France to the scuttling at Toulon, from the bombardment of the 3rd of July to the liberation of Paris, is lay out the terms of the argument with the clarity that the story deserves, and be honest about where the evidence leads and where it does not. The case for the necessity of Operation Catapult begins with the strategic situation of Britain in the summer of 1940. Britain was genuinely isolated. France had fallen. The United States was not yet in the war, and its eventual entry was far from certain. The Soviet Union had a non-aggression pact with Germany and showed no sign of abandoning it. Italy had joined the Axis. The possibility of German invasion of Britain was real and was being actively planned by the German military. In that context, the question of whether the French fleet would remain neutral, fall to Germany, or be actively turned against Britain was not an abstract strategic puzzle, it was a direct and immediate threat to national survival. The War Cabinet's conclusion that the risk of allowing the French fleet to remain in an ambiguous status was unacceptable can be argued against with hindsight, but it cannot be dismissed as unreasonable in the context of what the British government knew and feared in late June and early July of 1940. The case against the necessity of Operation Catapult, or at least against the specific form it took at Mers el-Kebir, begins with the Alexandria precedent. If Cunningham could resolve the same problem at Alexandria without killing anyone, through patience and personal diplomacy, why was that approach not applied at Mers el-Kebir? The answer requires acknowledging the genuine differences between the two situations, the different commanders, the different harbour geometries, the different time pressures, the different intelligence about incoming French reinforcements, while also acknowledging that the political decision in London to act on the 3rd of July may have contained within it a dimension of demonstration, of sending a signal to Washington and Berlin that was served by the dramatic action at Mers el-Kebir in a way that the quiet resolution at Alexandria could not have been. If that dimension of demonstration was present, and the historical record suggests it was, at least as a secondary consideration, then the question of necessity becomes more complicated, because some of the cost of Mers el-Kebir may have been paid for a purpose that went beyond the neutralization of the French fleet. The question of whether the armistice terms and Darlan's standing orders should have been trusted, the question that was at the heart of the British decision not to allow the French fleet to simply demobilize in place, receives its most challenging retrospective test from the events of November 1942 at Toulon. The scuttling of the fleet at Toulon demonstrated that French naval commanders would, when the moment came, honour their commitment to deny the fleet to Germany, even at enormous cost to themselves and to the institution they served. This retrospective validation of the French position has led some historians to argue that Operation Catapult was, in the strictest sense, unnecessary, that the outcome it was designed to achieve would have been achieved anyway through French self-denial, without the killing of nearly 1,300 men. Others argue that the Toulon scuttling cannot be cleanly separated from the context created by Mers el-Kebir itself, that the British action in July of 1940 demonstrated, with brutal clarity, the alternative to French self-denial, and that this demonstration may have contributed to the firmness with which the scuttling orders were ultimately obeyed. This argument is difficult to prove or disprove. It is also the kind of argument that reveals how deeply the event resists simple conclusions. The moral dimension of the judgment, the question of what the deaths of more than 1,200 men entail in terms of accountability and responsibility, requires a framework that the normal language of strategic necessity does not fully provide. Strategic necessity is a consequentialist framework. It argues that an action is justified if the outcomes it prevents are worse than the outcomes it causes. By that framework, if the British calculation about the risk of German seizure of the French fleet was correct, and it cannot be proven that it was not, then the deaths at Mers el-Kabir were the price of preventing a potentially catastrophic strategic reversal. The framework has a cold logic that is hard to entirely dismiss, but it is also a framework that can justify almost anything if the worst-case alternative is described in sufficiently dramatic terms. And one of the enduring discomforts of the Mers el-Kabir story is that the worst case the British were preventing was, in the end, a case that France was also committed to preventing through its own means. The historiography of Operation Catapult has evolved substantially over the decades since the war. The earliest accounts, written in the immediate post-war period, tended to accept the British government's justification largely at face value. This was an era in which the records of the War Cabinet were not yet available for scrutiny, in which the dominant narrative of the war emphasized British heroism and strategic clarity, and in which the specific circumstances of the Mers el-Kabir negotiations were not yet subject to the level of documentary analysis that later research would enable. As archives opened and historians on both sides of the Channel began to work through the primary sources, the picture became considerably more complex. The specific failures of communication around the ultimatum, Gensoul's partial summary to Paris, Holland's exclusion from direct meeting with Gensoul for most of the day, the role of time pressure in foreclosing negotiation all emerged from the archival record and changed the terms of the debate. French historiography of the event has, as mentioned in an earlier chapter, undergone its own evolution. The initial post-war tendency to frame Mers el-Kabir primarily as British treachery, a framing that served the Gaullist narrative of French honour under assault, gave way, over time, to a more nuanced account that placed the British action in the context of French political choices in the summer of 1940. The most honest French historical accounts of the event acknowledge that the armistice, which created the conditions for the British dilemma, was itself a choice made by French political and military leaders, and that the ambiguity of French naval neutrality under the armistice terms was a genuine problem that the British were not wrong to take seriously, even if the specific solution they applied was neither the only possible one nor the most humane. The comparative history of difficult decisions in total war offers some context for understanding how unusual or how typical Mers el-Kabir was. Total war of the kind that the Second World War represented had a consistent tendency to erode the normal distinctions between allies and enemies, between civilians and combatants, between permissible and impermissible acts. The decision to sink the French fleet was not, by the standards of what total war produced in that conflict, among the most morally extreme decisions made by any party. Far more people were killed by decisions with far less strategic justification. This context does not soften the specific tragedy of the 3rd of July, but it does place it in a frame that prevents the event from being treated as uniquely monstrous in a war full of monstrousness. Mers el-Kabir was, within the terrible moral economy of the Second World War, a difficult but not indefensible choice. That framing is available to those who want it. It does not compel acceptance. What history's verdict ultimately says about Operation Catapult may depend less on the specific facts of the event than on the broader moral framework that the person delivering the verdict brings to it. Those who believe that political survival, the survival of a democratic state in the face of a totalitarian aggressor, justifies the full range of costs that survival requires, will tend to view the British decision with understanding, if not approval. Those who believe that the means by which survival is pursued are themselves morally significant, that how you survive matters, not just whether you survive, will tend to view Mers el-Kabir as a choice that, whatever its strategic justification, carried a permanent moral cost. Both of those frameworks are defensible. Neither of them has a monopoly on the truth of what happened on the 3rd of July 1940 in a harbour on the Algerian coast, when the world was at its most frightened and its options were at their narrowest. The final word on the strategic verdict can perhaps be given to the simple fact that Britain survived that the worst fears of the summer of 1940, the fears that drove the Mers el-Kabir decision, did not materialize, the German invasion did not come, the French fleet did not become a German asset, the sea lanes held, American support grew, The Soviet Union entered the war after June of 1941 and drew the full weight of German military power eastward. The tide turned, slowly and eventually completely. Whether Operation Catapult was a necessary condition of that survival, or merely one factor among many in a complex strategic equation, is a question that historical method cannot resolve with precision. What it can say is that the decision was made, that it was executed at a terrible human cost, that its primary strategic purpose was achieved, and that the men and women who lived inside it in London, in Algiers, in Vichy, in Alexandria, on the ships of both navies carried the weight of it for the rest of their lives. Chapter 18. What remains? Every history arrives, eventually, at the question of what it leaves behind. Not what happened. We have spent 18 chapters examining what happened, in as much detail and with as much honesty as the surviving record allows. But what remains? What the events we have traced through these long hours together deposited in the world that followed them, in the institutions and the cultures and the political habits and the personal memories of those who lived through them. This final chapter is an attempt to answer that question, or at least a gesture toward an answer, because some deposits are too deep and too complex to be fully excavated in a single sitting. The most immediate and tangible thing that Operation Catapult left behind was the physical wreckage of the ships themselves. The Bretagne lay on the floor of Mers el-Kabir harbour, a memorial in iron and steel to the men who had gone down with her or died in the water around her. She was never fully salvaged. Parts of the Dunkirk were raised and used. The hull was eventually broken up. The ships at Toulon that were scuttled in November of 1942 were raised, over many years, and disposed of, some scrapped, some providing material for the post-war reconstruction of French industry. The physical traces of the event are gone, or scattered. What remains is not iron and steel, but memory, and memory is both more fragile and more durable than metal. The institutional legacy of Operation Catapult within the Royal Navy was real and lasting. The event established, in the clearest possible terms, that the British government was willing to use the Navy as an instrument of political will, even when the targets of that will were former allies rather than declared enemies. This was not a new capacity. Navies have always been instruments of political coercion, but the Mers el-Kabir action demonstrated it with a definiteness that had no precedent in the modern era. The Royal Navy drew lessons from the operational failures of the event, the escape of Strasbourg, the communications difficulties, the time pressure that foreclosed negotiation, and incorporated those lessons into its planning and command procedures. The human lessons, the ones about what it costs officers and men to be ordered to fire on former friends, were less systematically absorbed. Those lessons resided in individuals, in private conversations, in the private writing of men who had been there, and they dispersed gradually as those men aged and died, and their specific knowledge of the event passed out of living memory. The legacy within the French Navy was of a different character. Mers el-Kabir became, in French naval culture, one of the defining events in an institutional history that already contained more than its share of catastrophes and complexities. The event was commemorated, taught in the Naval Academy, referenced in the professional literature of the service, and carried in the memories of the officers and men who had been there. The specific lesson it taught, that the loyalty of an ally is not unconditional, that political decisions made far above the operational level can create situations in which professional naval officers are placed in positions of lethal danger by the very powers they had been fighting alongside, was a lesson that shaped French naval thinking about alliance relationships in the post-war period. France's later decisions about the terms of its participation in NATO, including the decision under de Gaulle in 1966 to withdraw French military forces from the integrated NATO command while remaining in the political alliance, cannot be understood without the long history of French ambivalence about the unconditional nature of military alliances, a history to which Mers el-Kabir is a central and painful contribution. The legacy in French national memory more broadly is a complicated one, as we have noted throughout this documentary. The event has never been forgotten. It sits in the French historical consciousness as one of the markers of the 1940 catastrophe, alongside the defeat itself, the armistice, and the beginning of the Vichy period. But its meaning has been contested across the decades, in ways that reflect the larger French struggle to reach an honest account of what happened in the years between 1940 and 1944. For many years, Mers-el-Kébir served primarily as evidence of British perfidy, a wound inflicted on a fallen friend, an act that seemed to confirm the worst about the nature of British alliance loyalty. As French historiography matured and the full picture of the period came into clearer focus, the event's meaning became more layered, not less painful, but situated within a context that acknowledged the choices France had made, as well as the choices that had been made for it. The legacy in British national memory has been, in some ways, the most curious of all. Operation Catapult is known to students of the Second World War and to naval historians, but it sits at the periphery of the popular memory of the conflict rather than at its centre. The dominant popular narrative of Britain's war, the narrative of Dunkirk, the Blitz, the Battle of Britain, El Alamein, D-Day, is a narrative of defence, resilience, and liberation. Mers-el-Kébir fits awkwardly into that narrative, not because it is hidden or denied, but because its moral texture, the killing of allies, the destruction of a partnership, the cold arithmetic of strategic necessity, does not map easily onto the heroic template that popular memory prefers. It is, in the literature of the period, a subject more often found in academic histories than in popular accounts, more often treated with complexity than with simplicity. That in itself is a kind of legacy, the legacy of an event that the culture has recognized, correctly, as too complicated for the simple frames that popular history usually applies. The legacy for the study of wartime decision-making, for the fields of strategic studies and international relations and military history that draw on the Second World War as a source of examples and lessons, is perhaps the most intellectually rich. Operation Catapult offers a case study in almost every major question that those fields ask. How should decision-makers handle radical uncertainty about an ally's future behavior? When is preventive action justified? And how much certainty about a future threat is required to justify present action with certain costs? How do the communication failures and personal dynamics of a specific negotiation affect the outcome of a decision that has been made at a much higher level? What is the relationship between military necessity and moral constraint in a total war context? How do the second-order effects of a decision, the political and diplomatic consequences that were not the primary intention, sometimes matter more than the first-order effects that the decision was designed to produce? Each of these questions is alive in the Mers-el-Kébir story, and each has been examined from multiple angles in the extensive literature that the event has generated. The legacy for the specific relationship between France and Britain, the bilateral relationship that has, in various forms, been one of the central partnerships in European history for many centuries, is one of resilience in the face of a very specific kind of test. The test was not simply one of military conflict or economic competition or colonial rivalry, all of which the two nations had experienced in earlier centuries. It was a test of whether an alliance could survive the commission by one partner of an act that the other partner experienced as a fundamental betrayal, the killing of its sailors, the destruction of its ships, the demonstration that no promise of loyalty was unconditional. The answer that history provided was qualified. The alliance survived, but not unchanged. It became something that both nations understood differently than they had before, a relationship grounded less in sentiment and more in shared interest, less in the romantic notion of eternal friendship and more in the pragmatic recognition that the alternative to working together was worse. That is, in its way, a more durable foundation for a relationship than romance alone could provide. But it is also a harder one, and the hardness has the shape of Mers-el-Kébir in it. As we approach the end of this documentary, there is a detail worth pausing on, a small, specific human detail that, in its particularity, says something about the kind of history we have been telling. In the years after the war, some of the officers of Force H and some of the officers of the French ships that had been at Mers-el-Kébir did in fact meet again. These meetings occurred at naval ceremonies, at commemorations, at professional gatherings of the kind that the post-war European military world produced. What was described by those who were present at such meetings was not, in general, confrontation or explicit reckoning with the past. What was described was something quieter and in some ways more powerful, a mutual acknowledgement, usually wordless or conveyed in a few careful sentences, that both groups of men had been in the same place at the same time, had been caught inside the same impossible situation, had done what they had been trained and ordered to do, and had carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. That acknowledgement across the language barrier, across the specific history of what had happened in that harbour, is one of the things that the record of those meetings most clearly communicates. The men who were at Mers el-Kabir are now all gone. The last of them lived into the 1980s and 1990s, in some cases into the early years of the 21st century, and they carried their memories of the 3rd of July, 1940, with them until those memories could no longer be carried. What remains of those memories is in the archives, in the testimonies they gave, in the letters they wrote, in the unit histories and the memorial books and the oral history projects that captured their voices before those voices were stilled. This documentary has drawn on those records throughout its 18 chapters, and it closes by acknowledging the debt it owes to the men and women who lived through these events and left behind the traces by which they can still be understood. History does not end. The events we have traced, the fall of France, the assembling of Force H, the long day of negotiations at Mers el-Kabir, the bombardment, the aftermath, the scuttling at Toulon, the liberation, the long work of reconciliation, are part of a continuous thread that runs through the present and into the future. The questions they raise about alliance, about necessity, about the terms on which nations trust each other, and the costs they are prepared to pay when that trust breaks down, are not questions that any century has resolved. They are questions that the world continues to ask, in different languages and different contexts, and the answer that Mers el-Kabir gave them, partial, painful, morally unresolved, remains one of the most honest answers in the record. This is where we leave the story. Not at a harbour on the Algerian coast, though the harbour is where it happened, but here, in the long, quiet space after the last chapter, where history settles into understanding, and understanding, if we are lucky, and if we are honest, becomes something more than memory.